Hello, everyone. Tonight I've prepared a special compilation of trucker stories, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now let's begin. The face floating outside my window from Diesel. Damn, the night shift always felt different, like the world had been dipped in something thick and slow, and when you drove through it, you moved through time itself at a crawl. I had been hauling freight for nearly 20 years, and I thought I had seen everything the road could throw at me. Wrong turns that added hours to a route, blown tires in the middle of nowhere, deer that appeared like ghosts in the headlights, their eyes reflecting back at you with an otherworldly glow. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what happened on that stretch of Interstate 40 outside of Amarillo. It was sometime past 2 in the morning, maybe closer to 3, and the highway was empty in that way that makes you feel like the last person on earth. The kind of empty where you start to question if the world behind you still exists, or if it dissolved into darkness the moment you passed through it. My cargo was a standard load, nothing special. Just pallets of canned goods heading to a distribution center in Oklahoma City. The hum of the engine was steady and constant. A low rumble that vibrated through the seat and up into my chest, and the white lines on the road kept disappearing under my hood in a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. I had the CB radio on low, just static and the occasional burst of chatter from drivers still awake and grinding through the night like me. There was comfort in that static, a reminder that I wasn't completely alone out here even if I couldn't see another soul for miles. The dashboard lights glowed a soft green, and my coffee, now cold and bitter, sat in the cup holder, forgotten. I wasn't tired, not really. Just settled into that zone where your body drives and your mind drifts, thinking about nothing and everything all at once. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was a reflection, maybe a trick of the light from a passing mile marker or the glow of my own dashboard bouncing off the glass. But then I looked again, really looked, and my heart dropped into my stomach like a stone into a well. There was a face outside my window, floating there in the darkness, keeping perfect pace with my truck. Not pressed against the glass like someone hanging on, but just there, suspended in the air about 3 feet away from the door, drifting alongside me like it had always been there and I had only just noticed. The face was pale, almost luminous in the darkness, with features that seemed both distinct and blurred at the same time, like a photograph left out in the rain. It was the face of a woman, I think, though there was something not quite right about it, something that made my brain struggle to process what my eyes were seeing. Her eyes were open, wide and unblinking, staring straight ahead, not at me but through me, as if I were the ghost and she were the one truly alive. Her hair, dark and loose, seemed to float around her head as if she were underwater, moving in slow, gentle waves that defied the wind that should have been tearing past at 70 miles per hour. I gripped the steering wheel harder, my knuckles going white, and I told myself to look away, to focus on the road, to convince myself that I was seeing things, that the hours and the darkness were playing tricks on my tired mind. But I couldn't look away. The face just kept floating there, so calm and serene, so impossibly present. I slowed down, easing off the gas, and the face slowed with me. I sped up, pressing the accelerator harder, and the face accelerated too, matching my speed exactly, as if tethered to my truck by some invisible thread. My breath came faster, shallow and sharp, and I could feel sweat beginning to bead on my forehead, despite the cool air blowing from the vents. I reached for the CB radio, fumbling with the handset, needing to hear another human voice, needing to confirm that I was still connected to reality. But before I could speak, before I could even press the button, the face turned. Slowly, deliberately, it rotated in the air until those wide, unblinking eyes were looking directly at me, and in that moment, I felt something cold and ancient wash over me, a feeling that I was being seen by something that should not exist. I don't know how long we stayed like that, me staring at her and her staring at me, but it felt like an eternity compressed into a handful of seconds. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the face began to fade, dissolving into the darkness like mist under the morning sun. until there was nothing left but the empty night and the sound of my own ragged breathing. I pulled over at the next rest stop, my hands shaking so badly I could barely shift into park. And I sat there in the cab with the engine running, trying to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing. But I knew I hadn't. I knew what I saw, and I knew that out there on the road, in the dark hours when the world is thin and strange, there are things that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. I finished that run, delivered my cargo, and drove back home, but I never took that route again. Not at night, not ever. And sometimes, when I'm driving and the hour gets late and the road gets empty, I find myself glancing at the window, half expecting to see that face floating there again, patient and eternal, waiting for me to look. The truck that hummed like a human from Mudflap Marty. There are sounds you get used to when you drive a truck for a living. Sounds that become part of the background noise of your life. The diesel engine's deep growl, the hiss of air brakes, the rattle of the trailer when you hit a rough patch of road, the whine of tires against asphalt. You learn to read these sounds, to understand what they mean, to know when something is wrong before the problem becomes serious. But what happened to me last October was something different, something I still can't explain, and it keeps me up at night sometimes, wondering if I'm losing my mind or if the world is stranger than I ever wanted to believe. I had just picked up a rental truck from a depot outside of Memphis, one of those situations where your own rig is in the shop and you need to keep moving. Keep making money, keep the wheels turning. The truck was older, a Freightliner from the early 2000s with plenty of miles on it and that worn-in feeling that comes from being driven hard for years. The paint was faded, the seats were cracked, and the whole cab smelled like old cigarettes and coffee. The ghost scent of 1,000 drivers who had sat where I was sitting, hauling loads across the country, living their lives on the highway. The first few hours were fine, normal, nothing out of the ordinary. I picked up my load, a delivery of industrial equipment heading to Little Rock, and I settled into the familiar rhythm of the road. The weather was cool, the sky overcast, and the traffic was light enough that I could make good time without pushing too hard. I had my music playing, classic rock, the kind of stuff that makes the miles go by easier, and I was feeling good, feeling like this was just another job, another day in the life. That's when I noticed the humming. At first I thought it was coming from the engine, maybe a belt that was wearing out or a bearing that needed attention. I turned down the music, listening carefully, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. But the humming didn't match the rhythm of the engine, didn't sync up with the RPMs or the speed of the truck. It was separate, distinct, a low, steady tone that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, vibrating through the cab in a way that made my teeth ache. I pulled over at a truck stop to check things out, popping the hood and looking over the engine, checking hoses and belts and anything else I could think of. Everything looked fine. Nothing obviously wrong, no leaks or loose parts or anything that would explain the sound. I got back in the cab, started the engine, and pulled back onto the highway, hoping that whatever it was had resolved itself. But the humming started again almost immediately, and this time I realized something that made my skin crawl. The humming wasn't mechanical. It sounded human. It was a voice, or something like a voice, a deep, resonant hum that rose and fell in a pattern that felt almost musical, almost like someone singing a wordless song. I turned off the radio completely, turned off the engine fan, rolled up the windows, anything to eliminate other sounds and isolate what I was hearing. And there it was, clear as day, a humming that sounded like it was coming from inside the dashboard, or maybe from beneath the seat, or perhaps from the walls of the cab itself, as if the truck had developed a voice and was singing to me. I tried to ignore it, told myself it was just some weird acoustic effect, some combination of road noise and wind and my own imagination, but the humming continued hour after hour, mile after mile, a constant, unchanging drone that filled the cab and filled my head until I couldn't think about anything else. I started talking to it, asking it questions, demanding that it stop, but the humming never changed, never responded, just continued in that low, mournful tone that made me feel like I was being mourned, like the truck was singing a funeral dirge for someone who was still alive. By the time I reached Little Rock, I was exhausted, not from driving but from the mental strain of listening to that sound for hours on end. I dropped off the load, returned the truck to the depot, and never asked about it, never mentioned what I had heard, because I knew how it would sound. Crazy, impossible, the product of too many hours on the road and not enough sleep. But I know what I heard, and I know that somewhere out there, that truck is still humming, still singing its wordless song, and I wonder sometimes who else has heard it, and if they were as disturbed by it as I was, or if they just drove on, ignoring the voice of a machine that had somehow learned to sound human. The ghost girl who sat beside me, from Big Mike loneliness, is part of the job when you're a long-haul trucker, something you accept when you sign up for a life on the road. You spend days, sometimes weeks, away from home, away from family, away from anyone who knows your name or cares if you make it to your destination. You learn to live with your own thoughts, to find comfort in the solitude, to appreciate the freedom that comes with being untethered from the everyday world. But there's a difference between being alone and feeling alone. And what happened to me one night in Montana crossed a line I didn't even know existed. I was hauling a load of timber from Missoula to Billings, a run I had done dozens of times before, a route I could drive in my sleep. The road was familiar, the turns predictable, and the scenery, though beautiful in daylight, was just a dark blur in my headlights as I pushed through the night. It was late, sometime after midnight, and I was the only vehicle on the road for miles in either direction. The silence inside the cab was absolute, broken only by the steady hum of the engine and the occasional crackle from the CB radio, which was picking up nothing but empty air. I was thinking about home, about my daughter and the birthday party I was going to miss, about how she was growing up so fast and I was missing so much of it. I was lost in these thoughts, feeling that familiar ache of being far away from the people I loved, when I felt a shift in the air inside the cab, a subtle change in pressure, like when someone walks into a room and you sense their presence before you see them. I glanced to my right to the passenger seat, and my heart stopped. There was a girl sitting there, maybe 10 or 11 years old, with long dark hair and pale skin that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light of the dashboard. She was wearing a white dress, simple and old-fashioned, and she sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead through the windshield. I jerked the wheel in surprise, nearly swerving off the road, and I slammed on the brakes, bringing the truck to a shuddering halt on the shoulder of the highway. I sat there, breathing hard, my heart pounding in my chest, and I looked at the passenger seat again, expecting it to be empty, expecting my mind to have played a cruel trick on me. But she was still there, still sitting in that same position, still staring ahead with an expression that was both calm and infinitely sad. I reached out, my hand shaking, and I tried to touch her to confirm that she was real, but my fingers passed through her as if she were made of smoke, and I felt a coldness that went deeper than temperature, a chill that sank into my bones and made me shiver uncontrollably. She didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge my presence in any way, just continued to stare through the windshield as if she were watching something I couldn't see, something that held her attention completely. I tried to speak, to ask her who she was, what she wanted, why she was in my truck, but the words caught in my throat and came out as a whisper, barely audible even to myself. And then slowly she turned her head and looked at me, and her eyes were dark and deep and filled with something that might have been sorrow, or might have been something else entirely, something I didn't have a name for. We stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, her looking at me and me looking at her, and I felt a connection form between us, a wordless understanding that transcended explanation. I knew in that moment that she was lost, that she had been lost for a long time, and that she was looking for something, searching for a way home or a way forward, or maybe just a moment of company in the endless darkness. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone, vanishing like a breath on a cold morning. leaving nothing behind but the faint scent of flowers and the lingering chill in the air. I sat there for a long time, trying to process what had happened, trying to make sense of the impossible. Eventually, I started the truck again and continued my journey. But I drove differently, more carefully, more aware of the spaces between things, the places where the world is thin and strange things can slip through. I never saw her again, but I think about her sometimes, about that ghost girl who sat beside me for a few brief moments, and I wonder if she found what she was looking for, or if she's still out there, still searching, still hoping for someone to see her and acknowledge that she was once real, once alive, once loved. The rest stop clerk, who never moved from Highway Hank rest stops, are strange places, liminal spaces that exist between destinations, between the life you left behind and the life you're driving toward. They're places where people pause, use the bathroom, grab a snack, stretch their legs, and then disappear back onto the highway, moving through these waypoints without really seeing them, without really thinking about the people who work there or the structures themselves. But there's one rest stop in particular, somewhere in the middle of Nebraska, that I'll never forget, and a clerk who worked there who I'm not entirely sure was human. It was a July night, hot and humid, the kind of weather that makes the air feel thick and heavy, like you're breathing through a wet blanket. I had been driving for 12 hours straight, pushing hard to make a delivery deadline, and I needed a break, needed to get out of the cab and move around before my legs cramped up and my back seized completely. I saw the sign for a rest area coming up and pulled off the highway, grateful for the chance to stretch and maybe grab a cold drink from a vending machine. The rest stop was small, just a single building with bathrooms and a small convenience area, surrounded by parking spaces for cars and trucks. There were a few other vehicles there, but no one around. No other drivers visible, which wasn't unusual for this time of night. I parked, climbed out of the cab, and walked toward the building, my legs stiff and sore from hours of sitting. The lights inside were fluorescent and harsh, casting everything in a cold greenish glow that made the place feel sterile and unwelcoming. Inside, behind a small counter near the entrance, sat a clerk, an older man with gray hair and a weathered face, wearing a uniform that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. He was sitting perfectly still, his hands folded on the counter in front of him, staring straight ahead at nothing in particular. I nodded to him as I walked past, a polite acknowledgement, but he didn't respond, didn't move, didn't even blink. I figured he was tired, zoned out, maybe lost in his own thoughts after a long shift, so I didn't think much of it. I used the restroom, splashed some cold water on my face, and felt a little more human. I walked back through the main area, planning to grab something from the vending machine before heading back to my truck, and I glanced at the clerk again. He was still there, still in the exact same position, hands folded, staring straight ahead, not moving at all, not even the slight rise and fall of breathing. I stopped watching him for a moment, waiting to see some sign of life, some indication that he was okay. Nothing. He sat there like a statue, like a mannequin placed behind the counter for decoration. I walked closer, feeling a creeping sense of unease. "Hello," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the empty space. "Are you all right?" No response. I waved my hand in front of his face, and his eyes didn't track the movement, didn't react in any way. They were open, focused on something I couldn't see, and they had a glassy quality that made my stomach turn. I reached out, hesitating, and then gently touched his shoulder. His body was rigid, cold, like touching a wax figure, and I jerked my hand back, my heart racing. I backed away, my mind trying to make sense of what I was seeing, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe he was sick. Maybe he had had a stroke or a heart attack and was frozen in place, though that didn't explain the coldness or the complete absence of any vital signs. I pulled out my phone, ready to call for help. But when I looked at the screen, I had no signal, no bars, nothing. I looked back at the clerk, and for just a second, I thought I saw his lips move, curling into the faintest hint of a smile. Though the rest of him remained completely still, I didn't wait around to find out what was happening. I walked quickly back to my truck, got in, locked the doors, and drove away from that rest stop as fast as I could without breaking any laws. I looked in my rearview mirror as I pulled back onto the highway, and I could see the building receding in the distance, the harsh light still glowing. And I swear I could see the clerk still sitting there behind the counter, motionless, watching the road, waiting for the next traveler to stop and wonder why he never moved. The tunnel full of frozen faces. From roadkill, there are parts of the country where the mountains force the highways to go through them rather than around them. Places where engineers carved tunnels through solid rock to keep the roads straight and the commerce flowing. These tunnels are necessary, practical, but they've always made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't quite explain. Something about being enclosed in all that stone and darkness. Something about the way sound changes inside them. Echoes and amplifies and distorts until you can't tell where anything is coming from. But the tunnel I drove through last winter in the Appalachians was different from all the others, and what I saw inside it has haunted me ever since. It was early February, and I was hauling a load of automotive parts from Charlotte to Pittsburgh, a route that took me through some of the most beautiful and treacherous terrain in the eastern United States. The weather had been bad for days, snow and ice making the roads dangerous, and I was taking it slow, being careful, giving myself plenty of time to react if something went wrong. The mountains rose up on either side of the highway, dark and imposing, covered in snow that looked gray in the dim afternoon light, and the clouds hung low and heavy, threatening more precipitation. I saw the tunnel entrance ahead, a black mouth carved into the mountainside, and I felt that familiar tightness in my chest that always came when I had to drive through one of these passages. I turned on my headlights, checked my mirrors, and guided the truck into the darkness, leaving the gray daylight behind. The tunnel was long, maybe 2 miles, and the walls were rough-hewn rock, dark and wet, glistening in the beam of my headlights. The sound of the engine changed immediately, becoming louder and more resonant, bouncing off the walls in a way that felt oppressive. About halfway through, I noticed something strange on the walls. At first, I thought it was just the texture of the rock, the natural patterns and formations that occur in stone, shadows and light playing tricks on my eyes. But then I looked more carefully, and I realized with a cold shock that what I was seeing were faces, dozens of them, hundreds of them, carved or formed or somehow embedded in the rock walls of the tunnel. They were human faces, or something close to human, with distinct features, mouths and eyes and noses, all frozen in expressions of terror or anguish or despair. I slowed down, unable to look away, my headlights sweeping across the walls and illuminating face after face, each one different, each one distinct, all of them seeming to watch me as I passed. Some of the faces were small, like children, and others were larger, adult-sized, and they covered every available surface, packed together so tightly that there was barely any space between them. Their eyes seemed to follow me, tracking my movement through the tunnel, and their mouths were open, as if they were trying to speak or scream, but no sound could escape. I felt my hands start to shake on the steering wheel, and I told myself to speed up, to get through the tunnel and back into the daylight as quickly as possible. But I couldn't look away from those faces, couldn't stop staring at them, trying to understand what I was seeing. Were they carvings, some kind of art installation or memorial? Were they natural formations that just happened to look like faces? Or were they something else? Something that shouldn't exist, trapped souls or echoes of people who had died in this place, their final moments preserved in stone. As I drove, I noticed that the faces seemed to be moving, subtly, almost imperceptibly, like they were breathing or shifting position. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, convinced that I was seeing things, that the stress and the darkness and the isolation were combining to create hallucinations. But when I looked again, the movement continued, a slow, synchronized undulation that made the tunnel walls seem alive, as if the mountain itself was breathing, inhaling and exhaling in a rhythm that was ancient and terrible. I pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing the truck faster than I should have, desperate to escape. The faces continued to stare, continued to watch. and I could feel their attention like a physical weight pressing down on me, suffocating and inescapable. And then, just before I reached the exit, I heard it. A sound that came from everywhere at once, a low, mournful wail that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. From the mouths of all those frozen faces, a chorus of voices crying out in a language I didn't understand, but that spoke directly to some primal part of my brain that understood grief and loss and endless suffering. I burst out of the tunnel into the gray daylight, and the sound cut off immediately, replaced by the normal rush of wind and the hum of tires on wet pavement. I kept driving, didn't stop, didn't look back, just focused on putting distance between myself and that place. Later, when I checked a map, I tried to find that tunnel again, tried to locate it so I could research it, maybe find some explanation for what I had seen, but I couldn't find it. There was no tunnel marked on that section of highway, no record of it in any of the maps or GPS systems I checked. It was as if it didn't exist, as if I had driven through something that occupied a space between reality and nightmare, and I wonder sometimes if I'm the only one who has seen it, or if there are others out there who have driven through that tunnel and seen those faces and heard that terrible wailing, and if they, like me, have been unable to speak about it without sounding completely insane. The mile marker that changes every night from Redneck Rick consistency is one of the things you learn to rely on when you're on the road. The idea that certain things will always be the same, that landmarks and signs and mile markers will be where they're supposed to be, providing structure and orientation in a world that's constantly moving. You memorize routes, recognize familiar features, know exactly how far you are from your destination based on the numbers that tick by on those green signs. But there's one stretch of highway in Nevada, out in the desert where nothing grows and nothing lives, where I discovered that not everything stays in its place, and sometimes the road itself seems to shift and change according to rules I don't understand. I was running a regular route between Reno and Las Vegas, a haul I did twice a week, carrying electronics and consumer goods between distribution centers. It was good, steady work, and I knew that highway like the back of my hand, every curve, every grade, every landmark. There was one particular section, about 50 miles south of Tonopah, that was especially desolate. Nothing but flat desert and distant mountains, and a sky so big it made you feel insignificant, and there was a mile marker there, marker 217, that I always used as a reference point, knowing that once I passed it, I was about 2 hours from Vegas. The first time I noticed something strange was on a Tuesday night, hauling south under a clear sky filled with more stars than I had ever seen in my life. I was cruising along, autopilot engaged in my brain, when I passed mile marker 217, except it wasn't where it should have been. It was about 5 miles further south than I remembered, which didn't make sense because mile markers don't move. I figured I was tired, that I had miscalculated or misremembered, and I didn't think much more about it. But 3 days later, when I made the return trip north, I paid closer attention, and mile marker 217 was back in its original position, exactly where I had always known it to be. Over the next few weeks, I started keeping track, making notes on a pad of paper I kept in the cab, marking down the exact location of that mile marker every time I passed it. And what I discovered made no sense whatsoever. The marker moved. Not every time, but often enough that it couldn't be explained by mistakes or faulty memory. Sometimes it would be 5 miles south of where it should be, sometimes 3 miles north, sometimes right where it belonged. There was no pattern that I could discern, no consistency to when or how far it moved. Just the undeniable fact that this 1 mile marker, out of all the thousands along that highway, refused to stay in one place. I started asking other drivers about it, bringing it up on the CB radio, casually mentioning it at truck stops when I ran into regulars who worked the same routes. Most of them looked at me like I was crazy, told me I needed more sleep or less coffee, laughed it off as a joke. But there were a handful of old-timers who had been driving these roads for decades, who got quiet when I mentioned it, who nodded slowly and admitted that yes, they had noticed strange things on that stretch of highway too. though they didn't elaborate and seemed reluctant to discuss it further. One night, I decided to stop right at the marker, to examine it closely, to see if there was anything unusual about the sign itself that might explain its apparent mobility. I pulled over onto the shoulder, put on my hazard lights, and walked back to where the marker stood, a simple green sign on a metal post, identical to every other mile marker on the highway. I touched it, ran my fingers over the reflective surface, checked the post to see if it was loose or recently installed. Everything seemed normal, solid, permanent. But as I stood there in the darkness, with the desert wind blowing across the empty land and the stars wheeling overhead, I felt a strange sensation, like the ground beneath my feet was shifting, sliding, rearranging itself in ways too subtle to see but profound enough to feel. I got back in my truck and continued my journey, and for the rest of that night, I had the uncomfortable feeling that the road itself was alive, that it was changing and adapting and moving according to its own will, and that the mile markers and signs and landmarks we used to navigate were nothing more than temporary suggestions, easily ignored or rearranged when the road decided to be different. I still drive that route, still pass marker 217 whenever I make the run between Reno and Vegas, and I still check its position every time, marking it down in my notes. And it still moves, unpredictably and inexplicably, reminding me that the world is stranger than we pretend it is, and that even the most solid and reliable things can prove to be illusions when you look at them closely enough. The cry that came from my cargo from tire iron Tony loading and unloading cargo is part of the routine when you drive a truck, something you do so many times that it becomes automatic. Muscle memory. Checking manifests and securing loads and making sure everything is properly tied down and balanced. You learn to think of cargo as objects, as things, as commodities that need to be transported from one place to another without any emotional attachment or personal investment. It's just stuff, boxes and crates and pallets, and you move it and deliver it and move on to the next load. But there was one shipment, one particular load that I hauled last spring, that changed the way I think about what I'm carrying, and I still have nightmares about the sound that came from inside that trailer. I picked up the load at a warehouse outside of Atlanta, a rush delivery that needed to reach Miami by the following morning. The manifest listed the cargo as medical equipment, which wasn't unusual. Hospitals and clinics need supplies, and time-sensitive medical shipments often command premium rates. The crates were wooden, sturdy, sealed with metal bands, and they were loaded into my refrigerated trailer, which struck me as odd for medical equipment, but I figured maybe it was pharmaceuticals or biological samples that needed to be kept cool. I signed the paperwork, secured the load, and hit the road, planning to drive straight through the night to make the deadline. The first few hours were uneventful, standard highway driving. Traffic thinning out as the evening progressed and most people headed home or to hotels for the night. I stopped once for fuel and a quick bathroom break, checked the trailer to make sure the temperature was holding steady, and continued south through Georgia into Florida. It was around midnight, somewhere near the state line, when I first heard the sound. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, a soft cry that seemed to come from behind me from the direction of the trailer. I turned down the radio, listening carefully, thinking maybe I had a mechanical problem, a bearing going bad or a tire developing a leak. But it wasn't mechanical. It was organic, unmistakably human, the sound of someone crying, a soft, desperate sobbing that made my blood run cold. I pulled over immediately, parked on the shoulder, and got out to investigate. I walked around the trailer, checking the doors, making sure they were still sealed and locked, which they were. The sound continued, muffled but clear, coming from inside the trailer, and I pressed my ear against the metal wall, listening. It was definitely crying, the sound of someone in distress, and my mind raced with possibilities, each one more disturbing than the last. I called the shipping company, got a night dispatcher who sounded bored and irritated at being bothered, and I explained the situation, told them I could hear someone crying inside the trailer. There was a long pause, and then the dispatcher told me in a flat, emotionless voice that I was not. Under any circumstances, to open the trailer, that the cargo was sealed and bonded, and any tampering would result in immediate termination and possible legal action. I said that if there was someone inside, someone who needed help, I had a moral and legal obligation to investigate. The dispatcher cut me off, repeated the instructions, and hung up. I stood there in the darkness, listening to the crying continue, feeling torn between following orders and doing what I knew was right. I decided to open the trailer. Consequences be damned, and I broke the seal and pulled open the heavy doors. The interior was cold, the refrigeration unit humming, and the crates were stacked neatly exactly as they had been loaded. But the crying had stopped the moment I opened the doors, replaced by absolute silence, and I stood there with a flashlight, scanning the cargo, looking for any sign of a person hiding among the boxes. There was nothing, no one, just crates of medical equipment sealed and labeled and perfectly ordinary. I closed the doors, resealed them as best I could, and got back on the road, shaken and confused. The crying didn't return, at least not that night, and I made the delivery in Miami without further incident. But I couldn't shake the memory of that sound. Couldn't stop wondering what I had really been carrying and what kind of medical equipment cries in the darkness. I asked around, tried to find out more about the shipment and the company that had contracted it, but I hit dead ends and evasive answers and people who clearly didn't want to discuss it. I still drive, still haul cargo, but now I wonder sometimes what's really in those sealed crates and boxes. And I listen carefully to the sounds coming from my trailer, hoping I never hear that crying again, but knowing that if I do, I won't be able to ignore it. The gas station with mirrors instead of windows from diesel. Dave gas stations are everywhere along the highways, so common and familiar that you barely notice them. Just pull in, fuel up, maybe grab a snack or use the restroom, and get back on the road. They're utilitarian spaces, designed for efficiency and quick transactions, and most of them blur together in memory, indistinguishable from one another. But there's one gas station I stopped at, somewhere in the desert southwest, I can't remember exactly where, that was different in a way that still bothers me. And I've spent a lot of time since then trying to figure out if what I experienced was real, or if I'd somehow driven into a waking dream. It was late afternoon, the sun low on the horizon, turning the desert landscape shades of orange and red and purple, and I needed fuel before the next leg of my journey. I saw a sign for a gas station at the next exit, an old weathered sign that didn't have a brand name, just the word gas in faded letters. And I pulled off the highway and followed a narrow road that wound through scrubby desert vegetation for about a mile before the station came into view. It was old, built in a style that reminded me of the 1950s, with rounded architecture and chrome accents, and it looked deserted, though there was a dim light glowing inside the main building. I pulled up to the pumps, which were ancient mechanical models with analog dials, and I got out of the cab, stretching my legs and looking around. That's when I noticed the windows, or rather the lack of windows. Instead of glass windows showing the interior of the station, there were mirrors, large polished mirrors set into the frames where windows should have been, reflecting the desert and the sky, and me standing there looking confused. I walked closer, examining them, trying to understand why anyone would build a gas station with mirrors instead of windows. And I saw my own reflection looking back at me, distorted slightly, as if the mirrors weren't quite flat. I tried the door to the main building, and it opened easily, swinging inward with a soft creak. Inside, the station was frozen in time, with old displays of motor oil and snacks, a cash register that looked like it belonged in a museum, and that same dim light coming from fixtures in the ceiling. And there, behind the counter, stood an attendant, a man in his 60s maybe, wearing a uniform and a cap, watching me with an expression that was both friendly and somehow wrong, like a smile painted on a face that didn't quite understand what smiling meant. "Welcome," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the empty space. "Need fuel?" I nodded, still looking around, trying to make sense of the place. The interior walls were also covered with mirrors, creating an infinite regression of reflections, and I could see myself repeated endlessly in every direction, each reflection slightly different, showing me from different angles, different moments. I told him I needed diesel, and he nodded and gestured toward the pumps outside, telling me to fill up and come back to pay. I went back outside and started fueling, watching the numbers spin slowly on the old mechanical pump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I looked at the building, at those mirrored windows, and in the reflection, I could see myself standing at the pump, but there was something else too. Another figure standing behind me, a shadow that shouldn't have been there. I spun around, heart racing, but there was no one, just empty desert and the sound of fuel flowing into my tank. When the tank was full, I went back inside to pay, and the attendant was standing in exactly the same position, as if he hadn't moved at all. I handed him cash, and as he made change, I asked him about the mirrors, why the station had mirrors instead of windows. He smiled that wrong smile again and said that mirrors were better than windows, that they showed you the truth instead of just what was on the other side. I didn't understand what he meant, and I didn't want to stay long enough to figure it out. I took my change, headed for the door, and as I left, I glanced back one more time. In the mirrors lining the walls, I saw reflections of the interior, the displays, the counter, but where the attendant should have been standing, there was nothing, just empty space, as if he didn't cast a reflection at all. I drove away from that gas station as quickly as I could, back to the highway, back to the familiar world of traffic and road signs and rational explanations. I've tried to find that place again, checked maps and GPS records, asked other drivers if they've ever seen a gas station with mirrors instead of windows, but no one knows what I'm talking about. And I'm starting to believe that it exists in a place that's not quite here, not quite anywhere. A way station for travelers who stray too far from the beaten path and need fuel to continue their journey into whatever comes next. The exit ramp that led to nowhere, from silent. Steve navigation has become so easy in the modern age, with GPS systems and smartphone apps telling you exactly where to go, what turns to take, how long until you reach your destination. It's made driving almost mindless, following the voice that guides you through unfamiliar territory, trusting that the technology knows better than you do. But I learned the hard way that sometimes technology fails, sometimes the maps are wrong, and sometimes you can take an exit that doesn't lead anywhere you want to be, an exit that appears on your screen but exists in a place that doesn't follow normal rules. I was hauling a load through the Midwest, crossing Kansas on Interstate 70, a route I had driven dozens of times before. It was late evening. The sun had just set, and the sky was that deep blue color that comes right before full darkness. My GPS was showing me my route, the familiar line on the screen tracking my progress, and I was making good time, planning to stop for the night in a few hours at a truck stop I knew well. That's when my GPS suddenly recalculated, showing a shorter route, an alternate path that would save me about 30 minutes. The screen showed an exit coming up in 2 miles, an exit I didn't remember ever seeing before, but I trusted the technology, figured maybe it was a new road or one I had simply overlooked in the past. The voice told me to take the exit in 1 mile, and I moved into the right lane watching for the exit sign. It appeared right on schedule, a standard green sign with white letters, showing an exit number that seemed slightly off, slightly wrong, like it didn't fit the sequence of numbers I'd been seeing. But I took it anyway, following the ramp as it curved away from the interstate. The ramp went on longer than it should have, curving and descending, taking me down and down into darkness that seemed deeper than the normal night. My headlights cut through the blackness, illuminating pavement that looked old and cracked with weeds growing through the asphalt, and I felt the first stirrings of unease. I looked at my GPS, expecting to see the alternate route displayed clearly, but the screen was flickering, showing static and distorted images, like it couldn't quite figure out where I was or where I was going. The ramp finally leveled out and connected to what looked like a 2-lane road, narrow and poorly maintained, stretching out into darkness in both directions. There were no lights, no signs, no indication of civilization in any direction. I stopped, put the truck in park, and tried to get my bearings. My GPS was completely useless now, just showing a blank screen with a loading icon that spun endlessly. My phone had no signal, not even one bar, and when I tried to use the Maps app, it couldn't determine my location. I sat there for a moment, trying to decide what to do. Logic said to turn around, go back up the exit ramp to the interstate, forget about the shortcut and stick to the known route. But when I looked behind me, the exit ramp was gone. Not hidden in darkness, not obscured by distance, but simply not there, as if it had never existed. Where the ramp should have been, there was just more of this narrow road, stretching into the darkness in the opposite direction. I felt panic rising in my chest, that primal fear that comes when you realize you're lost in a way that transcends normal lostness. When you're not just off your route, but somehow off the map entirely. I put the truck in gear and started driving, figuring that any road had to lead somewhere eventually, had to connect to something recognizable. I drove for what felt like hours, though my dashboard clock showed only 20 minutes passing and the landscape never changed. Just flat, empty darkness on either side of the road. No buildings, no trees, no features of any kind, just an endless nothing that pressed in from all sides. Then I saw lights ahead, distant but distinct, and I felt a surge of relief. Lights meant civilization, meant other people, meant a way back to the world I knew. As I got closer, I could see that the lights were coming from a town, a small collection of buildings arranged along the road. And I slowed down as I entered, looking for someone to ask for directions, looking for any indication of where I was. The town was strange. The buildings were old, constructed in styles that seemed to span different decades and different architectural traditions, all jumbled together without any coherent plan. The lights were on in windows, warm yellow glows that suggested people inside, but I couldn't see anyone. Couldn't see any movement or any signs of life. I drove slowly through the main street, if you could call it that, and I noticed that the buildings had no names, no signs identifying what they were or what purpose they served. I stopped in front of what looked like it might be a diner or a general store, got out of the truck and walked to the door. It was unlocked and I pushed it open, calling out a greeting. Inside, the space was furnished like a 1950s diner, with chrome stools and a long counter and booths along the walls, but everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, like it had been abandoned for decades, except the lights were on, and the air smelled like coffee and bacon, fresh smells that contradicted the evidence of long abandonment. I left quickly, got back in my truck, and continued through the town, desperate now to find a way out, to find something that made sense. On the other side of town, the road continued into more darkness, and I followed it, hoping it would eventually connect to something real. And then suddenly, without any transition or warning, I was back on the interstate, merging into traffic as if I had never left, as if the exit and the road and the strange town had been nothing but a momentary hallucination. My GPS came back online immediately, showing me exactly where I was, showing my route clearly with no alternate paths or shortcuts. I pulled over at the next rest area and checked my fuel gauge, my odometer, trying to find some evidence of the distance I had traveled during my detour. But everything was exactly as it should have been, as if no time had passed, as if I had never taken that exit at all. I still drive that route, still cross Kansas on Interstate 70. But I never trust GPS shortcuts anymore. Never take exits that my memory doesn't confirm. And I always wonder if that town is still out there somewhere, waiting in the darkness for the next driver who trusts their navigation system a little too much. The CB voice that called me. Daddy from Lonely Larry. The CB radio is a lifeline for long-haul truckers, a way to stay connected with other drivers, to share information about traffic and weather and road conditions, to combat the loneliness that comes with spending days or weeks away from home and family. You develop a kind of community on the CB, recognize voices, develop friendships with people you might never meet in person, but who become familiar companions during the long hours on the road. But there are also strange voices sometimes, Broadcasts that don't make sense. People who seem to be transmitting from places that don't exist or times that don't align with the present. I had been driving for about 15 years when it started. When I first heard the voice that called me Daddy, it was a child's voice, a little girl maybe 6 or 7 years old, and it came through the CB speaker clear and distinct, cutting through the usual static and chatter. "Daddy," the voice said, "where are you? I'm waiting for you." At first I thought it was a mistake. Someone's child playing with their CB radio, accidentally broadcasting on the trucker channels. I didn't respond, just kept driving, expecting the voice to fade or move to a different channel. But it came again a few minutes later, the same voice, the same words. "Daddy, where are you? I'm waiting for you." This time I picked up the handset, ready to tell whoever it was that they had the wrong person, that I wasn't anyone's daddy, at least not to a child that age. But before I could speak, the voice continued, and what it said made my blood turn to ice. "It's cold here, Daddy. It's so cold and I can't find the way home. You said you'd come back for me. You promised." I sat there with the handset in my hand, frozen, unable to speak or think clearly. The voice was so plaintive, so filled with genuine fear and loneliness that it cut through all my defenses and reached something deep inside me. I wanted to respond, wanted to tell this child that everything would be okay, wanted to help in some way. But I knew with a certainty that came from some instinct I didn't understand, that responding would be a mistake, that engaging with this voice would open a door I couldn't close. The broadcasts continued over the next several weeks, always when I was alone on a dark highway, always late at night when traffic was light and the world felt thin and strange. The voice never changed, always the same little girl, always asking for her daddy, always describing a cold, lonely place where she was waiting. Sometimes she would give details, describing trees and a body of water and a structure that might have been a bridge or a building, and I found myself trying to piece together where she might be, trying to figure out if this was some kind of real emergency, some actual child in distress who needed help. I asked other drivers about it, keyed up on the CB and asked if anyone else was hearing the broadcasts. Most of them said no, said they hadn't heard anything unusual. But there were a few who got quiet when I asked, who admitted in low voices that yes, they had heard strange things on the CB too, voices that shouldn't be there, messages that didn't make sense. One old-timer told me about a driver who had responded to a similar voice years ago, who had tried to help, who had followed the directions the voice gave, and ended up driving off the road into a ravine, killing himself in the crash. I stopped picking up the handset when the voice came through. I would just listen, feeling that terrible mixture of compassion and fear, wanting to help but knowing that I couldn't, that this was something beyond my ability to fix or understand. The broadcasts became less frequent over time, appearing only every few weeks instead of every few nights, and eventually they stopped altogether. I haven't heard the voice in over a year now, and I wonder sometimes if the little girl found her way home, if she found her daddy, or if she's still out there somewhere, broadcasting her lonely message into the darkness, hoping that someone will respond, will come for her, will end her long wait. But I also wonder if it was ever really a child at all, or if it was something else, something that uses the voice of a lost child to lure drivers into making mistakes, into responding to calls that lead nowhere good. I'll never know for sure, and maybe that's better. The CB is still my companion on long drives, still connects me to the community of drivers who share this life. But I'm more careful now about which voices I trust, which messages I respond to, and I never, ever answer when I hear someone calling me by a name that isn't mine. The frozen hitchhiker I dropped off last year, from Rusty Joe picking up hitchhikers, is something most truckers don't do anymore. A practice that's fallen out of favor due to safety concerns and company policies that explicitly forbid it. But there are still drivers who will stop for someone in need, especially in bad weather or remote locations where leaving someone stranded could be a death sentence. I used to be more willing to pick people up, back before I learned that sometimes the people on the side of the road aren't people at all, or if they are, They're not from the same time and place as the rest of us. It was January of last year, in the middle of one of the worst cold snaps I can remember. Temperatures well below zero. Wind chills that could kill an exposed person in minutes. I was driving through Wyoming heading east on Interstate 80, and visibility was poor due to blowing snow that created a whiteout effect. Traffic was light, most sensible people staying off the roads in weather like this. But I had a delivery deadline and experience driving in winter conditions, so I pushed forward carefully, taking my time, being as safe as possible. That's when I saw him, a figure standing on the shoulder of the highway, thumb out, the universal gesture of a hitchhiker looking for a ride. He was wearing inadequate clothing for the weather, just jeans and a light jacket, no hat or gloves, and I knew immediately that if I didn't stop, he would probably die out there. I pulled over, put on my hazards, and leaned over to open the passenger door, waving him in. He climbed up into the cab, and I felt a blast of cold air come in with him, colder even than the already frigid temperature outside. He was young, maybe early 20s, with dark hair and pale skin, and he was shivering violently. I turned up the heat, offered him a blanket from behind the seat, and asked him what he was doing out in this weather without proper gear. He looked at me with eyes that seemed distant, unfocused, and he said in a quiet voice that his car had broken down a few miles back, that he had been walking, trying to find help. I told him he was lucky I came along, that he could have frozen to death in less than an hour in these conditions. We drove in silence for a while, and I noticed that despite the heat blasting from the vents and the blanket wrapped around him, he didn't seem to be warming up. His shivering didn't decrease, and when I glanced at him, I could see frost forming on his eyebrows and eyelashes, as if the cold was coming from inside him rather than from the environment. I asked him where he was headed, where I could drop him off, and he said simply home, without providing any more specific information. After about 30 miles, we approached a small town, just a cluster of buildings around an exit, and he asked me to let him out there. I pulled off the highway and stopped at the top of the exit ramp, and he thanked me in that same quiet, distant voice, opened the door, and stepped out into the snow. I watched him walk away, heading toward the town, and then I continued my journey, glad that I had been able to help someone in need, feeling good about my decision to stop. That was last year, and last month I was driving that same route, heading east on Interstate 80 in similar weather conditions, cold and snowing and dangerous, and there he was again, the same hitchhiker in the same inadequate clothing, standing in almost the exact same spot where I had picked him up a year earlier. I slowed down, staring in disbelief, and as I passed, he turned and looked directly at me, his eyes meeting mine with a flicker of recognition, and he raised his thumb, asking for another ride. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me that this was impossible, that it couldn't be the same person, that it must be someone who just looked similar. But I knew it was him, knew with absolute certainty that I was seeing the same hitchhiker I had picked up exactly 1 year ago, standing in the same place, wearing the same clothes, needing the same help. I drove past watching him in my mirror, and he just stood there watching me go, his expression neither disappointed nor surprised, just patient, as if he knew I would be back, as if he would be there waiting the next time I drove this route. I did some research when I got home, searched news archives for stories about people who had died on that stretch of highway, and I found several accidents and exposure deaths going back decades. One story in particular caught my attention, about a young man who had frozen to death 23 years ago after his car broke down in a winter storm. His body found on the shoulder of the highway, frozen solid. The photo accompanying the article showed a face I recognized immediately, the face of the hitchhiker I had picked up, the face of the young man I had seen standing on the shoulder just a few weeks ago. I don't know if I helped him that night last year, if giving him a ride and dropping him off in that town provided him with some kind of peace or closure, or if I just participated in a loop, a repeated pattern that he's stuck in. picking up rides from drivers who don't realize they're transporting a ghost. I'll be driving that route again next month. And I know he'll be there, standing in the cold, needing a ride. And I haven't decided yet if I'll stop or if I'll drive past again, leaving him to wait for the next driver who doesn't know his story, who doesn't understand that some passengers can never reach their final destination. The truck stop that smelled like death from iron. Ike truck stops are designed to be welcoming places. Oases along the highway where drivers can rest and refuel and take care of basic needs before continuing their journeys. They're brightly lit, well-maintained, staffed by people who understand the rhythms and requirements of life on the road. You develop favorites, stops you look forward to, places where the food is good or the showers are clean or the staff remembers your name. But there's one truck stop, and I'll never forget it, that violated every expectation, that was so wrong in such a fundamental way that I still feel sick when I think about it. It was somewhere in Louisiana, I think, though the exact location has become fuzzy in my memory, like my mind is trying to protect me by erasing the details. I had been driving for 14 hours, pushing the limits of what was legal and safe, and I desperately needed to stop, needed to sleep for a few hours before I could continue. I saw a sign for a truck stop at the next exit, and even though the sign looked old and faded, even though something about it felt off, I was too tired to be picky, too exhausted to drive any further looking for something better. I pulled off the highway and followed the access road to the truck stop, which sat by itself in a clearing surrounded by dense forest. The building was large, old, built in a style that suggested it had been there since the 60s or 70s, and the parking lot was empty despite it being prime hours for driver turnover. The lights were on inside, and I could see movement through the windows, so I knew it was open. But the emptiness of the lot should have warned me, should have told me to get back on the highway and find somewhere else. I parked, grabbed my overnight bag, and headed toward the entrance. That's when I first noticed the smell. It hit me as soon as I opened the truck door, a thick, putrid odor that made me gag, the unmistakable smell of decay and rot and death. I looked around, trying to find the source, thinking maybe there was a dead animal nearby, something large that had crawled under the building and died. But the smell was everywhere, permeating the air, getting stronger as I approached the entrance to the building. Inside, the smell was overwhelming, so thick I could taste it, and I had to cover my nose and mouth with my shirt just to breathe without retching. The interior of the truck stop was brightly lit and fully stocked. Shelves full of snacks and supplies, coolers full of drinks, everything you would expect. But it was completely empty of people, or at least I thought it was at first. Then I saw the clerk behind the counter, a woman in her 40s maybe, wearing a uniform, staring at nothing with a blank expression. I approached the counter, my voice muffled by my shirt, and I asked if she was aware of the smell, if there was something wrong with the plumbing or the septic system. She looked at me slowly, her eyes focusing on my face with obvious effort, and she said in a flat, emotionless voice, "What smell?" I stared at her, unable to believe she was serious, unable to understand how anyone could not notice the overwhelming stench of death that filled the building. I told her I needed to use the restroom and maybe grab a shower, and she just nodded and pointed toward the back of the building. The restrooms were worse. The smell was so intense I could barely enter, and when I looked in the mirror, I saw that my eyes were watering. My face was pale. My body was physically reacting to whatever was causing this horrible odor. I didn't use the facilities, didn't shower, just turned around and walked back out, determined to leave, to find somewhere anywhere else. But when I got back to the main area, there were other people there now, drivers in various states of rest, sitting at tables or browsing the shelves, and none of them seemed bothered by the smell. None of them seemed to notice it at all. I walked quickly toward the exit, and one of the drivers, an older man with gray hair, looked up as I passed and smiled, a friendly, normal smile that somehow seemed horrifying in this context. He asked if I was leaving so soon, said I should stay and rest, said this was a good place to stop, a safe place. But his eyes, when I looked into them, were wrong, empty, like there was nothing behind them, like he was a shell animated by something that didn't understand how to properly mimic human behavior. I ran to my truck, started the engine, and drove away from that place as fast as I could, breaking speed limits to put distance between myself and that horror. I rolled down the windows despite the heat, desperate to clear my lungs of the smell, desperate to breathe air that didn't taste like death. And as I pulled back onto the highway, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw the truck stop receding in the distance, and for just a moment I thought I saw the building differently, saw past whatever facade it presented, saw it for what it really was, a place of decay and wrongness, a trap for the unwary and the exhausted. I've never been able to find that truck stop again, never seen another sign for it, never met another driver who admits to stopping there, but I know it exists. Know that it's waiting somewhere along a lonely highway for drivers who are too tired to notice the warning signs, too desperate for rest to trust their instincts. And I wonder sometimes how many drivers have stopped there and never left. How many are still there, sitting at tables or standing behind counters, animated by something that wears their faces and uses their voices but isn't them anymore. Just shells in a place that smells like death and promises rest that never ends. The rest stop without footprints from Ghost Gear. Gary, they call me Ghost Gear Gary because I'm real quiet when I shift. Got a smooth touch with the transmission that other drivers say is almost supernatural. Been driving for about 17 years now. Started young and worked my way up from local routes to cross-country hauling. I take pride in my driving and treating my truck right and being professional and safe and reliable. But there was this one night in Wyoming, this one impossible experience at a rest stop, that made me question everything I thought I understood about the physical world and the laws that govern it. It was late January, the dead of winter, and I was hauling industrial machinery from Montana down to New Mexico, running south on Interstate 25 through Wyoming. The weather had been brutal all day, temperatures well below zero, wind howling across the plains strong enough to buffet my truck and make steering a constant challenge. Snow had been falling on and off, not heavily but enough to make the roads treacherous, and I'd been driving carefully, taking my time, not pushing harder than conditions allowed. Around midnight, I saw a sign for a rest area 5 miles ahead and decided to stop. I needed to use the facilities and stretch my legs, and I wanted to check my load and make sure nothing had shifted in all that wind. The rest area, when I pulled into it, was fairly large with a good-sized parking lot and a modern building lit up against the darkness. There were 3 other trucks already parked and a couple of cars, enough to make me feel comfortable that it was a safe, populated place. I parked my truck, set the brake, and climbed down, immediately hit by the bitter cold. The temperature had to be at least 20 below, and the wind made it feel even colder, cutting through my heavy jacket like it wasn't there. I hurried toward the building, watching my step because I could see patches of ice on the pavement. The snow had stopped falling, but there was maybe 3 inches of it on the ground, more in the drifts where the wind had piled it up. Inside the building it was warm and bright, fluorescent lights humming overhead, and I stood in the entry for a moment just appreciating the heat. The place was clean and well maintained, with tile floors and informational displays about Wyoming wildlife and history. I headed for the restrooms, used the facilities, washed my hands, and stood at the sink for a moment, studying my reflection in the mirror. I looked tired, I thought, the lines around my eyes deeper than I remembered. But that was just part of the job, part of the price you pay for living on the road. When I came out of the restroom, I noticed something odd. There was a coffee machine in the corner, one of those fancy ones that makes different kinds of coffee and hot chocolate, and someone had left a cup sitting on the counter beside it. The cup was still steaming, clearly fresh, but I didn't see anyone around. I looked toward the entry and saw that the automatic doors were closed. Nobody coming or going. The building felt empty except for me, though I knew that couldn't be right because there were other vehicles in the parking lot. I walked over to one of the large windows and looked out at the parking lot. And that's when I noticed the second strange thing. The snow covering the ground was pristine, unmarked by any tracks or footprints. The 3 other trucks and 2 cars were parked exactly where they'd been when I arrived, but there were no tracks leading from any of them to the building. No footprints in the snow, no tire tracks showing how they'd gotten to their parking spots. No disturbance in the white surface at all except for my own footprints leading from my truck to the door. I stood there staring out the window, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Those vehicles had to have been driven here by someone, had to have parked at some point, and those drivers had to have walked to the building if they wanted to use the facilities. But there was no evidence of any of that. Just smooth, unbroken snow everywhere except where I'd walked. I checked my own footprints, making sure I wasn't imagining things, and they were clearly visible, dark impressions in the white snow showing exactly where I'd walked. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. I walked quickly to the entry doors, pushed through them back out into the cold, and looked around the parking lot with new attention. The other trucks and cars were all dark, no lights on, no sign of anyone inside them. I could see frost on all their windows, thick enough to obscure any view of the interiors, but I had the strong impression that they were empty, that they'd been sitting there empty for a long time. I walked toward the nearest truck, a blue Kenworth that looked similar to my own, and as I got closer I noticed something else strange. There was snow on the hood, a thick layer of it, and on the windshield built up in a way that suggested it had been sitting there for hours or even days. But the snow on the ground around it was flat and undisturbed. No indication that anyone had approached or left the truck recently. I brushed snow off the driver's side window and peered inside, cupping my hands around my eyes to see better. The cab was empty, but it looked lived in, with a jacket hanging on the back of the seat, a coffee mug in the cup holder, a logbook open on the dashboard. It looked like someone had just stepped away for a moment, like they'd be right back. But the layer of snow and the missing footprints told a different story. Suggested that whoever had driven this truck here had never gotten out, or had gotten out and never returned. I checked the other vehicles, walking carefully through the snow, very aware that I was the only person making tracks, the only person who was leaving any evidence of movement. Every vehicle was the same, dark, empty-looking, with snow accumulated on them but no tracks around them. One of the cars had a child's car seat visible in the back, and another had a bumper sticker that read, "I'd rather be fishing." Normal vehicles that belonged to normal people, but those people were nowhere to be found. I hurried back to the building, suddenly feeling very exposed and vulnerable out in that dark parking lot with the empty vehicles all around me. Inside, I looked for a phone to call the police, thinking that maybe these were abandoned vehicles, that maybe there'd been some kind of emergency that had caused their drivers to leave. But when I found the phone on the wall, I picked it up and heard nothing, no dial tone, just dead silence. I tried my cell phone next, pulling it from my pocket, but I had no signal, which wasn't particularly unusual in remote parts of Wyoming, but felt ominous given everything else. I stood in the center of the building, turning slowly, looking for any sign of another person, any indication that I wasn't alone. The coffee cup I'd noticed earlier was still sitting on the counter, still steaming slightly, which shouldn't be possible if nobody else was here, if nobody had made it recently. Then I heard something that made my heart skip, a sound coming from deeper in the building, from a hallway that led to what looked like storage rooms or maintenance areas. It was footsteps, slow and deliberate, the sound of someone walking on tile floor. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but got no response, just continued footsteps getting closer. I waited, watching the entrance to that hallway, ready to see whoever was walking toward me, but nobody appeared. The footsteps continued, got close enough that whoever was making them should have been visible in the main area with me. But I saw nothing, just empty space and bright fluorescent lighting. The footsteps stopped, and in the silence that followed I could hear my own ragged breathing, could feel my pulse pounding in my temples. I was alone in that building. I was certain of it now, but I was also not alone. There was something there that I couldn't see. Something that walked without leaving footprints in the snow outside or marks on the floor inside. I decided then that I needed to leave. Needed to get back to my truck and get back on the highway. Regardless of how tired I was or how much I needed a break. This place was wrong. Fundamentally wrong. And staying here any longer felt dangerous in a way I couldn't articulate. I moved quickly toward the entrance, keeping my eyes on that hallway, half expecting to see something emerge from it even though the footsteps had stopped. I pushed through the doors into the cold night air and ran. Actually ran back to my truck, my boots crunching in the snow that I'd walked through earlier. When I reached my truck, I climbed up into the cab and locked the doors immediately, then started the engine with shaking hands. As I waited for it to warm up enough to move, I looked back at the building and the parking lot, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There were people standing in front of the building now, maybe 6 or 7 of them, all looking toward my truck. They were just standing there in the snow, perfectly still, wearing regular winter clothes like they'd just come from those empty vehicles. But I hadn't seen any of them emerge, hadn't seen them walking or moving. They just appeared. Like they'd been there all along but invisible until this moment. And when I looked at the snow around them, I saw what I'd already suspected but hoped wasn't true. There were no footprints around them, no tracks showing where they'd come from. They were just standing there on top of the snow, not sinking into it, not leaving any impression, defying physics and gravity and everything I understood about how the world worked. One of them, a woman in a red coat, raised her arm and pointed at me, and when she did, all the others turned to look at my truck in perfect unison. They didn't move toward me, didn't threaten me in any obvious way, but the message was clear. They knew I'd seen them, knew I understood that something impossible was happening, and they were watching me leave, making sure I understood that I'd been somewhere I shouldn't have been, had witnessed something I wasn't meant to witness. I put my truck in gear and pulled out of that parking lot faster than was safe on the snowy pavement, not caring about the load or the regulations or anything, except getting away from those figures standing without footprints in front of that impossible rest stop. I drove for 2 hours straight, didn't stop until I was well past Cheyenne and into Colorado, finally pulling over at a brightly lit truck stop full of people in movement and normal activity. I tried researching that rest stop later. Tried to find information about it online or in my trucking atlas, but I couldn't identify exactly which one it had been. There were several rest areas along that stretch of Interstate 25, and they all looked similar in the photos I found. I called the Wyoming Department of Transportation, asked if they'd had any reports of strange activity or abandoned vehicles at any of their rest areas, but the person I talked to said no, everything was normal. All facilities were operational and safe. But I know what I saw, know what I experienced. That rest stop exists, somewhere between Casper and Cheyenne, and it's not what it appears to be. The vehicles in its parking lot are traps or markers or memorials, I don't know which. And the people standing in front of it without leaving footprints are something other than living humans. Something that exists in that space, but not quite in our world. Other drivers I've talked to, when I've been brave enough to bring it up, have similar stories about rest areas where things don't add up, where the physical evidence doesn't match what should be there, tracks that disappear, footprints that lead nowhere, vehicles that sit empty for days without anyone reporting them missing. One driver told me about a rest stop where he'd seen people inside the building, dozens of them, but when he blinked they were gone and he was alone. Another said he'd pulled into a rest area and found every vehicle in the lot perfectly arranged in rows, all the same distance apart, all facing the same direction, like someone had organized them with mathematical precision. I avoid that stretch of Wyoming in winter now, always plan my routes to either pass through during daylight or avoid it entirely, and when I do have to stop at a rest area, any rest area, I check for footprints in the snow first. Make sure that the tracks match the vehicles, that everything adds up the way it should. Because I know now that not every rest stop is really a rest stop, that some of them are something else, something that looks normal, but exists in a space between normal and impossible, catching tired drivers who don't pay attention, who don't notice when the footprints don't match the people, when the snow tells a different story than what your eyes see. If you're out there driving, if you're traveling through remote areas in winter and you see a rest stop that looks inviting, warm and bright against the dark, take a moment before you pull in. Look at the parking lot. Look at the vehicles. Look at the snow. Make sure the footprints are there. Make sure everything makes sense. Make sure the physical world is still following its rules. Because sometimes it isn't. Sometimes those rules get bent or broken or suspended entirely. And when they do, the smart thing is to keep driving, to find another place to stop, to wait for somewhere that leaves footprints in the snow like everything normal and human should. The town that only lives in shadow. From Marcus Delacroix. The headlights of my Peterbilt 379 cut through the pre-dawn darkness like twin knives, illuminating the cracked asphalt of Highway 47 as it wound through the Nevada desert. I'd been driving for 11 hours straight, my CB radio crackling with the occasional lonely voice of another trucker fighting off sleep somewhere out there in the vast emptiness. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, sitting in its thermos beside me like a forgotten friend, but the caffeine still hummed in my veins alongside the steady thrum of the diesel engine beneath me. That's when I saw the lights ahead, a warm amber, glow spilling across the horizon like honey poured over black velvet. At first I thought it might be Las Vegas catching the night sky, but my GPS showed nothing but empty desert for another 100 miles. The glow grew stronger as I approached, resolving into individual points of light that suggested a small town nestled in a valley between two low hills. Street lamps lined what appeared to be a main drag, and I could make out the soft illumination of windows in houses scattered across the landscape like fallen stars. My fuel gauge had been flirting with the quarter tank mark for the last 50 miles, and the sight of civilization was more welcome than a paycheck after a long haul. I downshifted as the highway curved toward an off-ramp that hadn't been marked on any of my maps, the air brakes hissing softly as I began my descent toward the town below. The place had an old-fashioned quality to it, as if someone had preserved a slice of 1950s Americana in amber and set it down in the middle of nowhere. The main street was wide enough for my rig, lined with mom-and-pop businesses that glowed warmly in the night. A diner called Moonbeam Joe's pulsed with blue and pink neon, its windows revealing a handful of customers hunched over coffee cups. A gas station called Desert Rose sat on the corner, its old-style pumps standing at attention like chrome sentinels. Everything appeared normal, even welcoming, yet something nagged at the back of my mind as I maneuvered my truck through the empty streets. The people I glimpsed through windows and walking along the sidewalks moved with a peculiar urgency, as if they were trying to accomplish a lifetime's worth of tasks in the space between sunset and sunrise. A woman swept her front porch with movements so quick and efficient they seemed almost frantic. A man painted his fence in rapid, precise strokes, pausing only to glance nervously at the eastern horizon, where the first faint blush of dawn was beginning to creep across the sky. I pulled into the gas station and climbed down from my cab, my joints protesting after so many hours on the road. The attendant who approached me was a thin man in his 60s, his face weathered like old leather, but his eyes held an intensity that made me take a step back. He moved with that same hurried quality I'd noticed in the other residents, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for the fuel nozzle. "Welcome to Twilight Falls, friend," he said, his voice carrying a slight tremor that might have been exhaustion or something else entirely. "Beautiful night, isn't it? Perfect for traveling, perfect for living. Much better than the day, don't you think? The day can be so harsh, so unforgiving." He began filling my tank with movements that seemed almost desperate in their efficiency. I tried to make small talk, asking about the town and how long he'd lived there, but his answers came in fragments between nervous glances at the sky. He'd been here 40 years, he said, and wouldn't trade it for anywhere else in the world. The town took care of its own, provided everything they needed, asked for very little in return. But as he spoke, his eyes kept darting to the horizon, where the darkness was gradually giving way to the gray promise of morning. "You should stay," he said suddenly, gripping my arm with surprising strength. "Rest up at Moonbeam Joe's. Martha makes the best pie west of the Mississippi. Sleep through the day, enjoy another evening with us. The desert sun can be murder on travelers." Something in his tone made the hair on my arm stand up, though I couldn't say why. I paid for the fuel and walked across to the diner, telling myself that a hot meal and fresh coffee would do me good before I continued on to Los Angeles. The interior of Moonbeam Joe's was straight out of a Norman Rockwell painting, all red vinyl booths and chrome fixtures, with a jukebox in the corner playing soft jazz that seemed to dance with the cigarette smoke hanging in the air. The other customers barely looked up when I entered, too busy eating with the same hurried intensity I'd observed throughout the town. Martha, the waitress, was a plump woman in her 50s who moved behind the counter like a dancer, her every motion economical and swift. She poured my coffee before I'd even settled into a booth, the liquid steaming in the cup like a small offering to the night. When I complimented her efficiency, she laughed, but it was a sound without humor. "Time's always short," she said, glancing toward the windows where the darkness was definitely retreating. "We make the most of what we have. You should too, hun. Stay with us through the bright hours. The rooms above the diner are comfortable, and you look like a man who could use some real rest." I was tired, bone-deep weary in the way that only comes from too many nights on the road and too much caffeine substituting for sleep. The prospect of a soft bed was tempting, but something about the way everyone kept insisting I stay made me uncomfortable. It reminded me of a spider I'd once watched, the way it kept repositioning its web to better catch the flies that buzzed nearby. As I ate my eggs and hash browns, I noticed that the other customers were finishing their meals and leaving, but not through the front door. They headed toward the back of the diner, through a door marked "Employees Only," moving with that same urgent purpose I'd seen everywhere else. Soon I was alone with Martha, who cleaned tables with movements so quick her hands were almost a blur. "Where is everyone going?" I asked, setting down my coffee cup with a clink that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. "Home," she replied without looking up from her cleaning. "Where everyone goes when the day comes calling. Some places aren't meant for sunlight, hon. Some things work better in the dark." Through the windows, I could see that the sky was definitely lighter now, the deep black of true night giving way to the purple gray of early dawn. The street lamps seemed dimmer somehow, as if they were struggling against the approaching daylight. The neon signs flickered more frequently, their colors washing out against the growing brightness. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The buildings across the street, which had seemed so solid and welcoming in the darkness, were becoming translucent as the light grew stronger. I could see through the walls of the hardware store to the empty lot beyond, could make out the skeletal framework of structures that had appeared complete just minutes before. Martha was still cleaning, but her movements had become frantic now, and when I looked at her closely, I realized I could see the booth behind her through her increasingly transparent form. The coffee cup in my hands was growing lighter, and when I looked down, I could see my own fingers through the ceramic. "What is this place?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my racing heart. "Twilight Falls," she said, her voice now coming from very far away, though she stood only a few feet from me. "We exist in the spaces between day and night, in the moments when the world holds its breath. We've been here so long that the sun doesn't remember us anymore, but we remember the sun and what it takes away." I stumbled toward the door, my legs feeling like they were moving through thick syrup. The morning light was definitely creeping across the eastern hills now, and with each passing second, the town became more ghostly, more insubstantial. My truck sat in the parking lot, still solid and real, its chrome bumper reflecting the first rays of dawn like a beacon of salvation. "Don't leave us," Martha called after me, her voice echoing as if from the bottom of a well. Stay with us in the darkness. We're so lonely when the light comes, so empty and forgotten. I reached my Peterbilt just as the first direct sunlight crested the hills and spilled across Twilight Falls like water rushing through a broken dam. The town didn't disappear all at once, but faded gradually, like a photograph left too long in the sun. The buildings became sketches, then suggestions, then nothing more than shadows on the desert floor. The people I glimpsed in windows became wraiths, then wisps, then memories of memories. The mile that remembers. From Jake Sullivan. The highway stretched ahead of me like a black ribbon under the pale moonlight, my 18-wheeler humming its familiar tune as I made my way through the Colorado mountains. I'd been driving this route for nearly 15 years, hauling freight from Denver to Salt Lake City, and I knew every curve, every grade, every mile marker by heart. The dashboard clock glowed a soft green, showing just past 2 in the morning, and the radio murmured low with late-night talk shows that helped keep the loneliness at bay. This particular stretch of Interstate 70 had always been one of my favorites during night runs. The mountains rose on either side like sleeping giants, their peaks crowned with snow that caught the starlight, and the air was so clean and thin that it seemed to sparkle in my headlight beams. Traffic was nearly non-existent at this hour, just the occasional set of taillights disappearing around a bend ahead, or headlights passing in the opposite direction, their drivers as anonymous as ghosts in the night. The engine's steady rumble beneath me was a comforting constant, the vibration traveling up through the steering wheel and into my arms. My coffee had grown cold in its thermos hours ago, but I'd developed a tolerance for the bitter taste over the years, and the caffeine still did its job of keeping my eyes sharp and focused on the endless yellow line that guided me westward through the darkness. Mile marker 182 appeared in my peripheral vision and slid past, followed by 183, then 184, each one marking another small victory in the long journey ahead. I'd memorized most of them without even trying, these simple green signs with their white numbers becoming familiar landmarks that helped me track my progress through the night. Some drivers found the monotony of long-haul runs mind-numbing, but I'd always found a strange peace in the rhythm of it all, the predictable sequence of markers and exits and rest stops that made up the geography of my working life. It was somewhere around mile marker 187 that I first noticed something was off. Though I couldn't quite put my finger on what had changed. The usual marker appeared on schedule, caught in my headlights for a brief moment before disappearing into the darkness behind me. But something about it had seemed different somehow. I glanced in my side mirror, but of course there was nothing to see except the red glow of my own taillights fading into the black. Mile marker 188 looked normal enough when it came into view. The familiar green rectangle with its white numerals standing at attention beside the guardrail, but as it passed by my window I could have sworn I caught a glimpse of something else on the sign, some additional marking or symbol that shouldn't have been there. The image lingered in my mind as I continued down the highway, a nagging sense that what I'd seen hadn't been quite right, though the rational part of my brain insisted it was just fatigue playing tricks on me. The next marker appeared right on schedule. Number 189 clearly visible in the white paint that reflected my headlight beam, but this time I was ready for it, slowing slightly and turning my head to get a better look as I passed. What I saw made my hands tighten on the steering wheel and sent a small chill down my spine. Below the number 189, painted in the same white lettering, was something that definitely didn't belong on a highway mile marker. It was a crude but unmistakable image of a smiling face, just 2 dots for eyes and a curved line for a mouth, like something a child might draw. But there was something unsettling about that simple smile, something that made it seem less innocent than mocking, as if it were sharing some private joke at my expense. I told myself it was probably just graffiti, some bored teenager with a can of spray paint looking to leave their mark on the world. But the image had looked too clean, too deliberately placed, and the paint appeared to be the same standard white used for the official highway markers. The steady drone of my engine seemed to grow louder in the silence, and I realized I'd unconsciously held my breath while studying the sign. Mile marker 190 showed the same thing, the grinning face below the number like a bizarre signature on what should have been a perfectly ordinary piece of highway infrastructure. The smile seemed wider this time, more pronounced, though I knew that was impossible. Road signs didn't change, and smiling faces painted on them certainly didn't grow larger between viewings. But still, the image burned itself into my memory with uncomfortable clarity, those two simple dots seeming to track my movement as I passed. By the time I reached mile marker 191, my heart had begun to beat a little faster, and I found myself anticipating each new sign with a mixture of curiosity and growing unease. The smiling face was there again, but now it seemed to have gained additional details that made it appear more realistic and somehow more knowing. The curve of the mouth looked deeper, more defined, and the dots that served as eyes seemed to have pupils that followed my truck as it rolled past. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my imagination, that the isolation and late hour were combining to play elaborate tricks on my mind. Long-haul drivers were no strangers to highway hypnosis and the strange visions that could result from staring at the road too long without a break. But even as I made these rational explanations to myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something genuinely unusual was happening here, something that defied the normal rules of three-dimensional reality. The radio crackled with static, and I reached over to adjust the frequency, grateful for any distraction from the growing strangeness outside my windshield, but the static seemed to form patterns as it hissed from the speakers, almost like whispered words just below the threshold of understanding. I turned the volume down and then off entirely, preferring the honest sound of my engine to whatever phantom voices my tired mind was finding in the white noise. Mile marker 192 appeared ahead, and I found myself slowing down again despite my attempts to maintain normal speed and pretend everything was fine. The smiling face was not only still there, but had somehow acquired even more detail and definition. Now it looked less like a simple drawing and more like an actual human face rendered in white paint, complete with subtle shadows and highlights that gave it an unsettling three-dimensional quality. And the expression had changed too, the smile now appearing less childlike and more knowing, as if it were aware of my growing discomfort and found it amusing. I pressed harder on the accelerator, suddenly eager to put some distance between myself and these increasingly disturbing mile markers. But marker 193 appeared all too quickly, and the face painted below the number had evolved again, now showing what looked like actual teeth within the smile, small white rectangles that gleamed in my headlight beam. The eyes had gained more definition as well, appearing almost lifelike in their painted sockets, and I could swear they turned to follow my passage along the highway. The rational part of my mind insisted that painted images couldn't change or move or watch, but the evidence of my own senses was becoming harder to deny with each passing mile. The face was definitely evolving, growing more detailed and more unsettling, and there was an intelligence behind those painted eyes that seemed to recognize my presence and react to my obvious discomfort. Mile marker 194 bore a face that looked almost photorealistic, as if someone had somehow transferred an actual photograph onto the green sign using white paint that perfectly captured every nuance of expression. The smile now revealed a full set of teeth, and the eyes had gained crow's feet at their corners that suggested age and experience, and a kind of patient amusement. Most disturbing of all, the face looked familiar somehow, as if I'd seen it before in some other context that I couldn't quite remember. I grabbed my CB radio and tried to raise another driver, anyone who might be traveling this stretch of highway, and could confirm what I was seeing. But the radio produced only static, the same pattern of white noise that had come from my AM receiver, and no amount of channel adjustment could find a clear frequency. The isolation felt complete now, as if I were the only living thing moving through this strange corridor where highway markers bore watching faces that grew more lifelike with each passing mile. By mile marker 195, The face had gained color somehow, the painted image now showing flesh tones and rosy cheeks and lips that appeared almost wet in the artificial light. The eyes were unmistakably human now, complete with irises and pupils that definitely tracked my movement. And the smile had taken on a quality of satisfied anticipation that made my skin crawl. I realized with growing horror that the face was becoming more familiar with each iteration, the features resolving into those of someone I recognized but couldn't quite place. Mile marker 196 showed my own face smiling back at me from the green highway sign, painted in perfect detail and wearing an expression of cruel amusement that I'd never remember making. The eyes were definitely my eyes, the same brown color and shape I saw in the mirror every morning, but they held a malevolence that felt alien and wrong. The smile was my smile too, but twisted into something mocking and predatory that bore no resemblance to any expression I'd ever consciously worn. The Storm Door, from Jake Morrison. CB radio had been crackling with warnings about the storm system moving through eastern Nebraska all evening, but I figured I could outrun it in my Peterbilt if I kept the hammer down on Interstate 80. 23 years of long-haul trucking had taught me to read weather patterns like sheet music, and this particular symphony of dark clouds rolling across the prairie looked fierce but manageable. My load of agricultural equipment bound for Des Moines wasn't time-sensitive, but I preferred sleeping in truck stops to riding out storms on the shoulder. So I pressed on through the gathering dusk with my high beams cutting through the increasingly heavy air. The first fat raindrops splattered against my windshield just past the Gretna exit, each one the size of a silver dollar and heavy enough to make my wipers work overtime. Within minutes, the scattered drops became a steady drumming, then a torrential downpour that reduced visibility to maybe 50 feet ahead of my bumper. The wind picked up with a vengeance, buffeting my trailer and making the steering wheel shimmy in my hands despite the weight of my cargo. Lightning began flickering on the horizon like a broken fluorescent bulb, and I knew I was in for a rough night whether I found shelter or not. That's when I spotted the truck stop sign through the sheets of rain, its neon letters partially obscured by the storm, but still readable enough to promise fuel, food, and most importantly, a place to park until this weather passed. The sign looked older than most, with that vintage styling you don't see much anymore. All curved edges and cheerful colors that seemed almost quaint against the violent darkness of the storm. I downshifted and took the exit, my Jake brake adding its distinctive growl to the symphony of wind and rain hammering my cab. The truck stop itself was smaller than I'd expected, just a modest building with a few gas pumps and a parking area that could accommodate maybe a dozen big rigs. Only 2 other trucks were already there, both backed into spots with their running lights glowing through the rain like distant stars. I found an empty space near the back of the lot and began the familiar ritual of securing my rig for the night, checking my load straps and setting my brakes while the storm raged around me. The rain was coming down so hard it seemed to bounce back up from the asphalt, creating a knee-deep mist that swirled and danced in the glow of the sodium vapor lights. As I was finishing my walk-around inspection, something caught my eye near the far edge of the parking area, where the lights barely reached. At first, I thought it might be another truck parked in the shadows, but as lightning illuminated the scene, I realized it was an old travel trailer, the kind families used for camping trips back in the 60s and 70s. It sat alone on what looked like a concrete pad, disconnected from any vehicle and seemingly abandoned. The aluminum skin was dull with age and weather, and several of the small windows showed only darkness behind their glass. What struck me as odd was that the trailer's door, a typical RV entry with a small window and metal screen, was standing wide open despite the driving rain. Even from a distance, I could see water streaming inside with each gust of wind, and I found myself wondering why anyone would leave it unsecured in weather like this. Perhaps the latch had failed, or maybe some transient had been using it for shelter and fled when the storm intensified. Either way, it seemed like a waste to let the interior get completely soaked when a simple matter of closing the door could prevent further damage. I grabbed my rain jacket from behind the driver's seat and stepped out into the storm, immediately feeling the full force of the wind and rain that had been held at bay by my cab. The journey across the parking lot to the trailer took longer than expected, partly because of the poor visibility, but mostly because I found myself oddly reluctant to approach the dark structure. Something about its positioning alone at the edge of the lot, like a forgotten memory, made my steps slow and cautious. The closer I got, the more details became visible in the intermittent lightning flashes, and none of them improved my impression of the situation. The trailer was older than I'd initially thought, probably dating back to the early 60s based on its rounded corners and distinctive window shapes. The exterior showed decades of weather damage, with streaks of rust running down from every seam and joint, creating abstract patterns that looked almost organic in the strange light. The open door swayed gently in the wind, its hinges producing a soft creaking sound that somehow carried over the noise of the storm. As I drew closer, I could smell something emanating from the dark interior, a mixture of mildew and old fabric that reminded me of my grandmother's basement after heavy rains. When I finally reached the trailer, I hesitated at the threshold, peering into the darkness beyond the open door. The interior was too dark to make out any details, but I could hear water dripping steadily onto what sounded like vinyl flooring. My flashlight beam revealed a surprisingly well-preserved cabin, with original upholstery on the dinette seating and curtains that, while faded, still hung neatly at the windows. Everything was soaked from the rain that had been blowing in, but underneath the water damage, the space looked as though someone had simply walked away from it decades ago and never returned. I reached for the door handle, intending to pull it closed and secure the latch, when another flash of lightning illuminated something that made me freeze in place. On the small dinette table, untouched by the rain that had been streaming through the open door, sat a road atlas opened to a map of Nebraska. The pages showed no signs of water damage despite being directly in the path of the wind-driven precipitation, and a red circle had been drawn around the exact location of this truck stop. Next to the atlas lay a small notebook, its pages dry and unmarked by moisture, with handwritten entries that were too distant for me to read clearly. The logical part of my mind insisted that there had to be a reasonable explanation for why these items remained dry while everything else in the trailer showed obvious water damage. Perhaps they'd been placed there recently, after the storm began, or maybe the wind patterns were creating some kind of protective pocket of air that deflected the rain. But as I stood there in the doorway, water streaming from my jacket and the storm raging around me, logic felt like a fragile thing easily swept away by the growing sense that something was fundamentally wrong with this entire situation. I stepped inside the trailer, drawn by curiosity and the need to examine the mysterious dry objects more closely. The moment my boots crossed the threshold, the sound of the storm seemed to diminish, as though the thin aluminum walls provided far more insulation than they should have been capable of. My flashlight beam played across the notebook, revealing pages filled with dates, locations, and what appeared to be descriptions of weather events. Each entry was written in the same careful handwriting, documenting storms across the Midwest with an almost scientific precision that spoke of years of dedicated observation. The dates troubled me deeply once I began to process them properly. The earliest entries went back more than 40 years, yet the handwriting showed no signs of aging or change, remaining consistent across decades of supposed observations. More disturbing still were the locations mentioned, a pattern of truck stops and rest areas along major interstate highways, each one associated with severe weather events that had occurred exactly as predicted in the notebook. The entry for tonight's storm was already there, written in the same steady hand, predicting the exact time and intensity of the weather system that had driven me to seek shelter. As I flipped through more pages, a creeping realization began to take hold of my thoughts like ice forming on a windshield. Every location mentioned in the notebook was a place I had stopped during my years of driving. Rest areas and truck stops scattered across my regular routes where I had waited out storms or taken mandatory breaks. The dates corresponded to nights when severe weather had forced me to alter my travel plans. Times when I had found myself seeking shelter in places I had never intended to visit. The pattern was too specific to be coincidental, too detailed to be the work of someone making random observations about weather and traffic. The final entry in the notebook made my blood run cold, despite the humid air inside the trailer. Written in that same unchanging handwriting, it described not just tonight's storm, but my specific truck down to the make, model, and even the agricultural equipment I was hauling to Iowa. It predicted my arrival time at this truck stop, with an accuracy that suggested either impossible foresight or something far more unsettling. Below that entry, in letters slightly larger than the rest, was written a single line that made the hair on my arm stand up despite the warmth of my rain-soaked jacket. The door only opens during storms, and only for those who are meant to find it. Thunder crashed overhead with enough force to shake the trailer, but inside the aluminum shell the sound seemed distant and muffled, as though it were coming from another world entirely. I became aware that the rain was no longer blowing through the open door behind me, despite the fact that the storm continued to rage outside with undiminished fury. Signal 0. From Marcus, the thing about being an over-the-road trucker for 37 years is that you learn to appreciate the small comforts that keep you sane during those long, lonely stretches of asphalt. My CB radio was one of those comforts, that trusty Cobra 29 mounted just above my sleeper bunk, always crackling with the familiar symphony of static, chatter, and the occasional burst of profanity from drivers warning about smokies or road conditions ahead. The static was like white noise to me, a mechanical lullaby that had sung me to sleep in truck stops from Seattle to Miami. That's why it took me nearly 4 hours to realize something was fundamentally wrong on that rain-soaked October night somewhere between Amarillo and Oklahoma City. I was running a load of auto parts in my Peterbilt 379, the engine humming its familiar diesel melody as the wipers fought against sheets of rain that seemed to come at the windshield sideways. The highway stretched ahead like a black ribbon, illuminated only by my headlights and the occasional flash of lightning that turned the prairie landscape ghostly white for split seconds at a time. It was the kind of night that made you grateful for the warm cab and the steady rhythm of the road beneath 18 wheels. The CB had been quiet for a while, which wasn't unusual for this stretch of I-40 during the late hours, but as I reached for the handset to break squelch and see if anyone was out there, I noticed something that made my skin crawl in a way I couldn't quite explain. There was no static. The channel selector was set to 19, same as always, and the squelch was properly adjusted. But when I keyed the mic, instead of the usual burst of white noise that preceded transmission, there was only perfect, crystal clear silence. Not the kind of silence you get when equipment fails, but an active, almost breathing quiet that seemed to press against my eardrums. I tried channel 9, then 13, then swept through all 40 channels, and each one was the same. No static, no background hiss, just that unnatural clarity that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up like a dog, sensing something wrong in the dark. The rain continued its relentless assault on the windshield as I fiddled with the controls, checking connections and trying to convince myself that it was just some atmospheric anomaly caused by the storm. But deep in my gut, where instinct lives and logic fears to tread, I knew this wasn't about weather or equipment malfunction. This was something else entirely. The silence from the radio seemed to seep into the cab, making even the familiar sounds of the engine and road noise feel muted and distant, as if they were being filtered through layers of cotton or heard from underwater. That's when the first voice came through, clear as a bell and close as if someone were sitting in the passenger seat beside me. "Eastbound Pete at mile marker 127, you got your ears on?" The voice was friendly enough, with that familiar trucker cadence I'd heard a million times before. But something about it made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. Maybe it was the fact that I'd just passed mile marker 127, or maybe it was the way the voice seemed to know exactly what kind of truck I was driving. But every instinct I'd developed over nearly 4 decades on the road was screaming at me to stay quiet. I picked up the handset anyway, because isolation does strange things to a man's judgment, and keyed the mic. Yeah, this is the Eastbound Pete, go ahead. The silence that followed stretched for nearly 30 seconds, long enough for me to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing, before the voice came back with a deep chuckle that made something cold slither down my spine. Good to hear another voice out here in the dark, driver. Been mighty quiet tonight, hasn't it? Almost like the whole world just stopped talking all at once. There was something in the tone that suggested the speaker found this amusing in a way that normal people shouldn't, and I found myself checking my mirrors more frequently, though the rain made it impossible to see much beyond the red glow of my trailer lights. Yeah, it's been quiet, I replied, keeping my voice neutral while my mind raced through the possibilities. Maybe it was another driver who'd been monitoring the channels. Maybe someone with a powerful base station who could track vehicles. But the feeling in my gut was growing stronger, cold and heavy like swallowed ice. The miles rolled by in increasingly uncomfortable silence until the voice returned, and this time there was no mistaking the wrongness in it. You know what I find interesting, Eastbound Pete? Been watching you for quite a while now, and I notice you haven't seen another vehicle in over an hour. Not one single car, truck, or motorcycle. Don't you think that's strange for a major interstate highway? As soon as he said it, I realized he was right, and the realization hit me like a physical blow. In all my years of driving, I'd never seen I-40 completely empty, not even in the deepest hours of night or the worst weather. There were always a few cars, night shift workers heading home, other truckers pushing to meet delivery deadlines, someone. But tonight, the highway stretched empty in both directions. A wet black void that seemed to swallow my headlights and give nothing back but more emptiness. Who is this? I asked into the handset, trying to keep the growing fear out of my voice, but the answer that came back made my blood turn to slush in my veins. Just another driver like you, Marcus. Been following the same route, carrying the same load, having the same conversation over and over and over again. You ever get the feeling you've been somewhere before? Done something before? Like you're stuck in a loop that just keeps repeating? He knew my name. I hadn't given my name over the radio, and it wasn't painted on my truck or displayed anywhere a casual observer could see it. The CB crackled with perfect clarity as his voice continued, now taking on a tone of mock sympathy that made my skin crawl. Check your odometer, Marcus. Check it real careful and tell me what you see. My eyes dropped to the instrument cluster, and what I saw there made the world tilt sideways around me. The trip odometer, which I'd reset when I left Amarillo, read exactly 127.3 miles, the same reading it had shown for the last 4 hours. The same reading it had shown when I'd passed mile marker 127 and heard that first transmission. The laughter that came through the CB was unlike anything human, a sound that seemed to echo from someplace far deeper than the throat. And as it filled the cab, I realized that the rain on the windshield was falling in exactly the same pattern it had been hours ago. The same drops hitting the same spots in the same rhythm. The lightning was flashing in identical intervals, illuminating the same stretch of prairie with the same ghostly light. I pressed the accelerator to the floor, watching the speedometer climb to 80, then 85, but the mile markers continued to crawl by at the same impossible pace, and the odometer remained frozen at 127.3. The voice returned, now multiplied into a chorus of identical speakers, all saying the same words in perfect unison. Eastbound Pete at mile marker 127, you got your ears on? Good to hear another voice out here in the dark, driver. Been mighty quiet tonight, hasn't it? Almost like the whole world just stopped talking all at once. That's when I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the CB handset and hurled it against the windshield, watching it shatter into pieces that scattered across the dashboard. But the voices continued, now coming from the broken remains of the radio, from the speakers, from the very air around me, all asking the same question over and over. You got your ears on? You got your ears on? You got your ears on? I yanked the steering wheel hard to the right and felt the truck leave the pavement, bouncing and lurching through the muddy grass of the median, while the voices reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the very frame of the cab. The world spun, tilted, and everything went dark as the truck rolled once, twice, then came to rest on its wheels with an impact that rattled every bolt and rivet. When I came to, I was sitting in the cab of my Peterbilt on the shoulder of I-40, engine idling, wipers working steadily against a light drizzle. The CB radio was intact and functioning normally, crackling with the beautiful, familiar sound of static. According to my odometer, I was at mile marker 127.3, and according to my logbook, I'd been driving for exactly 4 hours since leaving Amarillo. But on the seat beside me, where no passenger had been sitting, was a CB handset that didn't belong to my radio, and when I picked it up, I could feel it was still warm to the touch. As I stared at it, trying to make sense of what had happened, it crackled to life with perfect, impossible clarity, the Scribe's Highway. From Marcus Webb, the first time I caught that smell drifting through my cab's ventilation system, I thought someone had spilled printer ink at a rest stop and the wind had carried it down the interstate. Sweet, chemical with an underlying metallic tang that made my sinuses tingle. I was hauling a load of office furniture from Portland to Sacramento on Highway 5. The kind of run I'd done 100 times before in my 30-year career behind the wheel of big rigs. My Peterbilt 379 had been my faithful companion for the better part of a decade, her chrome exhaust stacks gleaming under the amber highway lights as we carved through the Oregon darkness. It was well past midnight when that peculiar scent first invaded my nostrils, carried on a wind that seemed to blow against the natural patterns I'd grown accustomed to reading during my years of night driving. The CB radio crackled with the usual chatter between drivers, but something about their voices seemed muted, distant, as if the radio waves themselves were struggling to penetrate whatever atmospheric disturbance was creating that ink-laden breeze. I adjusted the air conditioning, thinking perhaps the cabin filter needed replacing, but the smell only grew stronger, more pronounced, until it felt like I was breathing in liquid words that hadn't yet found their way onto paper. The highway stretched ahead in its familiar ribbon of asphalt and painted lines, but the landscape on either side had taken on an otherworldly quality in the strange wind, trees bent at impossible angles, their leaves rustling with a sound like shuffling manuscript pages. The tall grass in the median swayed in waves that reminded me of cursive handwriting, flowing script written by an invisible hand across the earth itself. My headlights cut through the darkness, but they seemed to catch glimpses of movement that vanished the moment I tried to focus on them, like words erasing themselves from a blackboard the instant you turned to look. The smell of ink grew so intense that I could taste it on my tongue, metallic and sharp like licking the tip of a fountain pen. I rolled down my window, hoping fresh air would clear my head, but the wind that rushed in carried even more of that chemical sweetness, so concentrated now that it made my eyes water. Through my tears, the road ahead began to shimmer and blur, the yellow center line seeming to writhe like golden snakes across the pavement. I blinked hard, gripping the steering wheel tighter, but the optical illusion persisted. Growing stronger with each mile, I traveled deeper into whatever strange weather system had settled over this stretch of interstate. The CB radio began to emit sounds that weren't quite static and weren't quite voices, a rhythmic scratching noise like a quill pen moving rapidly across parchment. I reached over to adjust the squelch, but the scratching grew louder, more insistent, until it resolved into what sounded almost like Morse code. Long scratches and short ones, forming patterns that my brain tried desperately to decode even though I'd never learned that particular language. The truck's engine hummed its familiar diesel lullaby beneath the strange transmission, but even that comforting sound seemed altered, as if the very air through which the sound waves traveled had changed its fundamental properties. Mile marker 247 passed by my window, and I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The numbers weren't printed in the usual reflective white paint, but appeared to be written in flowing black script, as if someone had taken a calligraphy brush dipped in India ink and carefully lettered each numeral by hand. I slowed the Peterbilt, downshifting to get a better look, but as my speed decreased, the wind outside began to howl with increased ferocity, buffeting the truck with gusts that felt almost intentional. as if something was trying to push me back up to highway speed. The overhead signs began to change as well, their familiar green backgrounds now hosting text that flowed and shifted like living things, route numbers twisted into unfamiliar configurations. City names rearranged their letters while I watched, forming words in languages I didn't recognize but somehow understood on a visceral level. Sacramento became something that meant place of endless sentences. Portland transformed into harbor of unwritten stories, and the mileage indicators showed distances that couldn't possibly be accurate, claiming destinations that were simultaneously 0 miles away and infinitely far. I tried to radio for help, keying my microphone and calling out to any drivers who might be monitoring Channel 19, but my voice sounded strange even to my own ears, distorted as if the words were being translated through multiple languages before emerging from the speaker. The response that came back wasn't in any human voice I'd ever heard, but rather a sound like pages turning rapidly in a vast library, punctuated by the soft whisper of ink drying on paper. The sound formed patterns that felt like meaning without actually conveying information, leaving me with the unsettling impression that I was being answered by something that communicated through written words rather than spoken language. The landscape outside my windows had become completely surreal now, the ink-scented wind having transformed the familiar Oregon countryside into something from a fever dream. Hills rolled like the pages of an open book, their contours forming letters in some titanic alphabet that spelled out messages I couldn't quite decipher. Power lines hung between poles that resembled enormous fountain pens, their tips pointed skyward as if ready to write upon the clouds themselves. Even the stars seemed different, arranged not in the constellations I knew but in patterns that suggested paragraphs of celestial text, stories written across the night sky in points of light. My fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, but the needle was moving in a way that defied physics, oscillating in rhythm with the scratching sounds from the radio. The speedometer displayed my velocity in what appeared to be characters from ancient manuscripts rather than numbers, illuminated symbols that shifted between runic alphabets and flowing Arabic script. The GPS screen had gone completely black, except for a single line of text that appeared and disappeared too quickly for me to read completely, though I caught fragments about the road where stories are born and travelers who carry tales in their wake. The wind outside reached a crescendo of intensity just as I crested a hill and saw what lay in the valley below. Spread across several acres of what should have been farmland was what could only be described as a printing press the size of a factory, its massive rollers and plates visible in the moonlight, operated by figures too distant and shadowy to make out clearly. The machine was in constant motion, producing sheets of paper that caught the wind and swirled upward in enormous spirals, creating cyclones of printed pages that fed the ink-scented gale that had been pushing against my truck. For the past hour, the text on those airborne pages was visible even from my position high above on the interstate, dark lines of print that seemed to glow with their own inner light. As the papers spiraled higher, I could see that they contained stories, thousands of them, millions of them, tales of every description rising into the night sky to join the atmospheric river of narrative that was flowing across the continent. Some of the pages caught against my windshield, adhering to the glass long enough for me to glimpse fragments of the stories they contained. Adventures and mysteries and romance and horror, all mixing together in the great aerial manuscript that surrounded my truck. The exit ramp I needed was coming up, the one that would take me away from this supernatural weather system and back toward the normal world of truck stops and loading docks. But as I approached the off-ramp, the wind intensified to nearly hurricane force, and the pages swirling around my truck began to form shapes, humanoid figures made of printed text that pressed against my windows with what felt like desperate urgency. Their paper hands left inky smears on the glass, and through those dark marks I could see their faces, features composed entirely of written words, eyes that were periods, mouths that were commas, expressions that changed as the text rearranged itself. I floored the accelerator, my diesel engine roaring as I fought against the wind to reach the exit. Pages of manuscript slapping against my windshield like enormous moths drawn to my headlights. The paper figures followed alongside my truck, running with impossible speed, their forms constantly shifting as new words wrote themselves across their surfaces. One of them managed to climb onto my hood, its text-based face pressed against the windshield directly in front of me, and I could see that its features were composed of my own name, repeated thousands of times in different fonts and sizes, as if this creature of living narrative knew exactly who I was and what stories I carried within myself. The exit ramp curved away from the main highway, and as soon as my wheels left the interstate proper, the wind died to nothing and the paper figures dissolved back into ordinary darkness. The smell of ink faded gradually from my nostrils, replaced by the familiar sense of diesel fuel and night air. My radio crackled back to normal CB chatter, drivers discussing weather conditions and road construction, their voices reassuringly human after that hour of strange, scratching sounds. The mile markers returned to standard reflective numerals. The overhead signs displayed normal city names and route numbers, and my instrument panel showed readings in conventional Arabic numerals rather than mystical scripts. The Symphony of Exit 127. From Marcus Wheeler. The fog rolled in like a living thing that Tuesday night, thick and gray and hungry, swallowing the interstate mile by mile until my Peterbilt's headlights could barely cut through 10 feet of darkness. I'd been driving cross-country freight for 15 years, and I thought I'd seen every kind of weather the highway could throw at a man. But this fog was different, pressing against my windshield like it was trying to get inside, making shapes that almost looked like faces before dissolving back into nothing. The CB radio had gone silent an hour back, just static and the occasional burst of what sounded like music, though the melody was too distorted to make out. My GPS showed I was somewhere in eastern Oregon, threading through the Blue Mountains on a stretch of I-84 that usually stayed busy even at 2 in the morning. But tonight I hadn't seen another soul on the road since the fog descended. It was just me, my 18-wheeler loaded down with auto parts bound for Portland, and that unnatural mist that seemed to glow faintly in my peripheral vision. The diesel engine hummed its familiar tune beneath me, a steady rhythm that had lulled me through 1,000 sleepless nights, but even that comforting sound felt muffled now, absorbed by the thick air pressing in from all sides. I could barely make out the reflective markers on the road's edge, those little cat's eyes that were supposed to guide truckers through the worst conditions. They appeared and vanished in my headlight beams like fallen stars, there one moment and swallowed by gray nothing the next. That's when I saw the sign emerging from the fog ahead, an exit marker that made me ease off the throttle and squint through the windshield. Exit 127, it read, with an arrow pointing toward a ramp that disappeared into the mist. But there was something wrong with that sign, something that made the hair on my arm stand up even though I couldn't put my finger on what it was. Maybe it was the way the lettering seemed to shimmer or how the metal looked too new and bright for this forgotten stretch of mountain highway. What really caught my attention, though, was the music. It started as my rig drew parallel to the exit ramp, a faint melody that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Not from my radio, which was still hissing with static, and not from outside either. The music felt like it was rising from the road itself, seeping up through the asphalt and into my bones. It was beautiful and sad and strangely familiar, like half-remembered lullaby from childhood, played on instruments I couldn't identify. I should have kept driving. Every instinct I'd developed in 15 years of long-haul trucking told me to ignore that exit, to push through the fog and find a proper truck stop where I could wait out this unnatural weather, with other drivers and strong coffee and the reassuring chatter of the CB. But the music was growing stronger now, weaving itself around my thoughts like smoke, and I found my hands turning the wheel almost without conscious decision. The exit ramp curved away from the interstate, and down through stands of pine trees that loomed like dark sentinels in the fog. My headlights caught glimpses of their trunks, massive and ancient, but the spaces between them seemed to pulse with that same faint luminescence I'd been noticing in the mist. The music was clearer now, a complex harmony of strings and woodwinds and something else, something that might have been human voices singing wordlessly in the distance. At the bottom of the ramp, instead of the usual cluster of gas stations and restaurants that marked highway exits, I found myself facing a simple 2-lane road that disappeared into the glowing fog. There were no signs indicating which town lay ahead, no businesses visible through the mist, just that narrow strip of asphalt leading toward whatever waited in the gray unknown. The music was all around me now, beautiful and hypnotic, seeming to come from the very air itself. I downshifted and let the Peterbilt roll forward, its engine muttering quietly as we moved deeper into whatever strange pocket of the world I'd discovered. The fog grew thicker with each passing moment, pressing against my windows like curious fingers, and I realized I could no longer see the road's edges or the forest that had flanked the exit ramp. It was as if my truck was floating through a gray void, guided only by the faint line of asphalt visible a few feet ahead, and the increasingly complex symphony that filled the air around me. The music was changing now, becoming more elaborate and orchestral, as if I was approaching the source of the performance. I could pick out individual instruments, violins and cellos and flutes, all playing with perfect precision in harmonies that made my chest tight with emotion I couldn't name. But underneath the beauty there was something else, a subtle discord that set my teeth on edge and made me grip the steering wheel tighter. That's when I began to see the lights. They started as tiny pinpricks in the fog, scattered and distant like fireflies in summer grass. But as I drove deeper into the mist, they grew brighter and more numerous, forming patterns that almost made sense before shifting into new configurations. They danced around my truck in slow spirals, keeping pace with my speed, pulsing in time with the music that now seemed to be coming from the lights themselves. I tried to reach for my CB radio, thinking I should call for help or at least try to raise another driver who might know what was happening. But when I looked down at the dashboard, all the familiar gauges and indicators had gone dark except for the speedometer, which showed I was moving at a steady 40 miles per hour, even though I hadn't touched the accelerator in minutes. The radio was silent, its display blank, as if the fog had somehow cut me off from the outside world entirely. The lights were getting bolder now, swooping closer to my windows and leaving trails of phosphorescence in their wake. They seemed almost playful, like they were inviting me to join their ethereal dance. The music swelled around me, so beautiful it nearly brought tears to my eyes. And I found myself leaning forward in my seat, trying to see deeper into the glowing mist ahead. That's when I realized the lights weren't just dancing around my truck. They were leading me somewhere, forming a corridor of soft illumination that guided me along the invisible road. And somewhere ahead, barely visible through the fog, I could make out the suggestion of structures, buildings or monuments that seemed to pulse with the same gentle radiance as the lights themselves. The music reached a crescendo that filled every corner of my cab, so loud and complex it should have been overwhelming, but instead felt like the most perfect sound I'd ever heard. For a moment, I wanted nothing more than to follow those lights to whatever destination they were guiding me toward. To leave my truck behind and walk into that beautiful glowing mist and become part of the symphony myself. But some deep survival instinct kicked in. The same primal alarm that had kept my ancestors alive in dark forests and unknown territories. The music was too perfect, too hypnotic, and those lights were leading me away from everything I knew and understood. Whatever waited in that fog-shrouded destination ahead, I suddenly knew with cold certainty that if I reached it, I would never leave. I slammed on the brakes and cranked the wheel hard to the right, feeling the trailer jackknife slightly as I fought to turn the big rig around on the narrow road. The lights seemed to pulse with agitation, swarming around my windows like angry wasps, and the music took on a pleading quality that tugged at my heart. For a terrifying moment, I thought the truck wouldn't respond, that whatever force controlled this place wouldn't let me go. But the Peterbilt's engine roared to life with renewed power, and suddenly we were moving again, retracing our path through the fog as the lights fell behind us and the music faded to a melancholy whisper. I didn't slow down until I saw the blessed sight of the interstate ahead, its familiar lanes and reflective markers like a lifeline back to the real world. The fog began to thin as I merged back onto I-84, and within minutes I could see stars again and the distant glow of a truck stop on the horizon. When I looked in my mirrors, there was nothing behind me but normal darkness and the usual scatter of headlights from late-night traffic. I never found exit 127 on any map, and the GPS in my truck showed no record of the route I'd taken that night. But sometimes on foggy nights when I'm driving alone through mountain passes, I catch faint echoes of that beautiful, terrible music drifting through the static on my CB radio. And I know that somewhere out there, in the space between the marked exits and the charted roads, those lights are still dancing in the mist, waiting for the next traveler to hear their symphony and follow them home. The Mirror's Passenger, from Jake Morrison. The thing about driving long haul is that you get used to being alone, but you never really get comfortable with it. 37 years I've been pulling freight across these highways, and I've learned that solitude has a weight to it, pressing down on your shoulders like fog settling in a valley. My Peterbilt 379 has been my home for the better part of 2 decades now, her chrome polished to mirror brightness, her engine humming that low, reassuring rumble that's become the soundtrack to my existence. But it was that chrome, those mirrors specifically, that started showing me things I wasn't prepared to see. It began 3 months ago on a run from Portland to Memphis, somewhere in the long stretch of Montana, where the horizon seems to swallow the world whole. The autumn rain had been falling steadily for hours, drumming against my windshield in that hypnotic rhythm that makes your eyelids heavy, despite the caffeine coursing through your veins. I kept glancing at my passenger side mirror, checking for traffic that never seemed to materialize on these lonely stretches of interstate. That's when I first noticed her. She was sitting in what would have been my passenger seat, if I'd had a passenger seat visible in that particular mirror's angle. A woman, maybe in her 30s, with dark hair that seemed to absorb the dim light from my cab. She wore a simple blue dress, the kind you might see at a church social or a small-town diner. Nothing remarkable about her, really, except for the fact that when I turned to look directly at where she should have been sitting, there was nothing there but empty space and the familiar clutter of my logbooks and coffee cups. But in the mirror, she remained, her hands folded neatly in her lap, staring straight ahead with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not sad, not happy, just present. Waiting, maybe. I rubbed my eyes, figured it was the road fatigue playing tricks on me. 300 miles still to go before my mandatory rest break, and the rain kept falling, each droplet catching the glow of my running lights like tiny amber jewels before sliding down the glass and disappearing into the darkness. I tried to ignore her after that first sighting, but ignoring something in your mirror when you're a trucker is like trying to ignore your own heartbeat. You check those mirrors constantly. Its survival instinct burned into your muscle memory after thousands of miles. And every time I glanced at that passenger side mirror, she was there. Sometimes she'd be looking down at her hands, sometimes gazing out at the passing landscape, but always there, always in that same blue dress, always just outside the edge of reality. The second night, somewhere in the Kansas wheat fields where the wind never stops whispering through the grain, I decided to test my theory. I pulled into a truck stop, one of those big, well-lit places where the diesel pumps stand like mechanical sentries under pools of harsh white light. I climbed down from my cab, walked around to the passenger side and checked that mirror from every angle I could think of. Nothing unusual about it, just standard chrome and glass, reflecting back my own weathered face in the neon glow of the truck stop sign flickering red and blue against the night sky. But when I climbed back into my cab and settled behind the wheel, there she was again. This time she had turned slightly and I could see her profile more clearly. She was younger than I had initially thought, with delicate features and skin that seemed to have a luminescence all its own. There was something familiar about her, though I couldn't place where I might have seen her before. I found myself talking to her reflection, my voice barely audible over the engine's idle rumble. "Who are you?" I asked the mirror, feeling foolish but unable to stop myself. "What do you want?" She didn't respond, didn't give any indication that she could hear me, but I thought I saw her shoulders shift slightly, as if she were settling in for a long journey. The fluorescent lights of the truck stop buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that seemed to dance across her reflection, and I found myself staring so intently that I nearly jumped out of my skin when another driver knocked on my window to ask for jumper cables. By the third week, she had become as much a part of my routine as checking my fuel gauge or marking my logbook. I started talking to her regularly, one-sided conversations that helped pass the endless miles between loading docks. I told her about my ex-wife, about the divorce that had cost me my house and sent me back to over-the-road driving full-time. I told her about my daughter Sarah, who lived in Phoenix with her mother and only called on holidays. Her voice polite but distant, like we were strangers making small talk. The passenger in my mirror never responded, but sometimes I felt like she was listening. There was something comforting about her presence, even though I knew it couldn't be real. The human brain, I reasoned, creates all sorts of coping mechanisms when faced with isolation and stress. She was probably just my subconscious manifesting some kind of companion to make the loneliness bearable. That theory worked fine until the night I saw her move. I was hauling a load of electronics through Nevada, the desert stretching out on both sides of the highway like an alien landscape, painted in shades of silver and black. The moon was full that night, so bright it almost hurt to look at directly, and it painted everything in stark relief. I was making good time, the engine running smooth and strong, when I glanced at my passenger mirror during a routine check. She was looking at me, not just turned slightly in my direction, but actually making eye contact through the reflection. Her dark eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made my breath catch in my throat. I forced myself to keep my eyes on the road, hands steady on the wheel, but I could feel her gaze like a physical weight. When I looked back at the mirror a few seconds later, she had returned to her normal position, staring straight ahead, but something had fundamentally changed. The next morning at a truck stop outside of Reno, I called my daughter Sarah. We hadn't spoken in almost 2 months, and her voice was surprised when she answered, maybe even a little concerned. I found myself telling her about the passenger, in my mirror, expecting her to laugh or tell me I needed to see a doctor, but she went quiet for a long moment. "Dad," she said finally, "do you remember Aunt Lisa?" The name hit me like a physical blow. Lisa. My sister Lisa, who had died in a car accident when she was 32, 3 years before Sarah was born. Lisa, who had always worn simple dresses and had that same luminous quality to her skin. Lisa, who used to fold her hands in her lap just like that when she was thinking or waiting for something. She was wearing a blue dress when they found her. Sarah continued, her voice soft. "Mom showed me pictures once. She said Aunt Lisa always wanted to travel to see the country, but she never got the chance." I ended the call shortly after that, my hands shaking as I climbed back into my truck. The passenger side mirror reflected nothing but empty space and the usual clutter of my cab, but somehow that felt even more unsettling than seeing her there. I drove the rest of that day in a kind of numb shock, the revelation echoing in my mind with each mile marker that passed. That evening, somewhere in the Colorado mountains where the air is thin and the stars seem close enough to touch, she appeared again. But this time was different. This time, when I looked at her reflection, she slowly raised one hand and pressed her palm against what would have been the inside surface of the passenger window. I could see the outline of her fingers, delicate and translucent, and for just a moment I thought I could see my breath fogging in the cab, despite the heater running full blast. I pulled over at the next rest area, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The mountain silence was profound, broken only by the ticking of my cooling engine and the distant call of an owl somewhere in the darkness. I sat there, for almost an hour, staring at that mirror, but she didn't appear again that night. Now here's the thing that keeps me awake during my mandatory rest periods. The thing that makes me check that mirror obsessively, even though part of me dreads what I might see. Over the past month, she's been changing. Not dramatically, not in ways that would be obvious if you weren't looking for them, but I notice she's becoming more vivid, more present somehow. Sometimes I can almost see her chest rise and fall as if she's breathing. Sometimes I hear what might be a voice, so faint it could be wind or engine noise or imagination, but it sounds like my name. And yesterday, somewhere in the Texas panhandle where the wind scrapes across the earth with nothing to stop it, I saw her turn toward me again. But this time, along with that direct eye contact that makes my skin crawl, I saw her lips move. The chromatic cargo. From Marcus Chen. The thing about long-haul trucking is that after 23 years behind the wheel, you think you've seen everything the interstate system has to offer. Every rest stop, every way station, every mile marker between Seattle and Miami becomes as familiar as the coffee-stained dashboard of your cab. But sometimes, just sometimes, the road decides to show you something new. Something that makes you question whether those familiar highways are quite as predictable as you thought they were. It was a Tuesday night in late October when I picked up the strangest freight of my career from a warehouse outside Bakersfield. The facility wasn't listed in any of my usual directories, just a set of GPS coordinates my dispatcher had texted me, along with a terse message. Special delivery, no questions, good money. The warehouse sat alone in a stretch of agricultural land, surrounded by dormant almond orchards that stretched into the darkness like sleeping armies. The building itself was unremarkable, a standard metal-sided structure with a few dim security lights that barely illuminated the loading dock. What struck me as odd was how quiet everything was. Most warehouses buzz with activity even during night shifts, forklifts beeping, workers calling out to each other, the general hum of industry. This place felt empty, abandoned almost except for the single figure waiting by the loading bay. The man who met me was tall and thin, wearing coveralls that seemed too clean for warehouse work. He didn't offer his name or any paperwork, just gestured toward my trailer and said the load was ready. When I asked about the manifest, he handed me a single sheet of paper with nothing but a destination address in Tucson and a notation that simply read, "Fragile materials, temperature controlled." I watched through my side mirror as they loaded 12 identical crates into my refrigerated trailer. Each crate was about the size of a large coffin, made from some kind of dark metal I couldn't identify, with no visible markings or labels. The loading crew worked in complete silence, moving with an efficiency that suggested they'd done this exact job many times before. What bothered me most was how they handled the crates, not with the typical industrial pragmatism of warehouse workers, but with something approaching reverence, as if they were carrying precious relics rather than freight. The first few hours of the drive passed normally enough. Interstate 5, south to the 58 East, the familiar rhythm of the diesel engine settling into that hypnotic drone that makes the miles disappear. The radio picked up a classic rock station out of Fresno, and I found myself humming along to songs I'd heard 10,000 times before. It wasn't until I was climbing through the Tehachapi Mountains that I first noticed something unusual in my mirrors. At first, I thought it was just the reflection of my running lights playing tricks on me, but as I crested the pass and began the long descent toward the Mojave Desert, I could see a faint glow emanating from the gaps around my trailer doors. It was subtle, barely visible, like the light from a television screen in a darkened room. I pulled over at the next truck stop, a lonely outpost called Desert Rose that catered to drivers making the long haul across the wasteland. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a couple of other big rigs whose drivers were presumably catching some sleep in their cabs. I walked around to the back of my trailer, expecting to find a loose light fixture or maybe some kind of electrical short. The temperature control unit was humming normally, maintaining the steady 38 degrees the mysterious manifest had specified. But as I stood there in the desert quiet, I could definitely see light seeping out around the trailer doors, a soft, pulsing glow that seemed to shift through different colors as I watched. I tried the doors, but they'd been secured with a lock I didn't have the key for, which wasn't unusual for high-value cargo. Still, the light was definitely coming from inside, and it was definitely not any kind of standard freight I'd ever hauled. The glow would fade to almost nothing, then slowly brighten again, cycling through what looked like blues and greens and purples, like some kind of enormous mood ring breathing in the darkness of my trailer. Getting back on the road, I tried to put it out of my mind. Drivers haul all kinds of strange cargo, from circus animals to military equipment to art installations bound for galleries in major cities. Hell, I once transported a full-size replica of the Statue of Liberty to a casino in Nevada. Weird freight was just part of the job, and the extra money I was making on this run would cover my truck payment for the next 3 months. But as the night wore on, and I pushed deeper into the Mojave, the light show in my trailer began to intensify. What had started as a faint glow, visible only in my mirrors, was becoming bright enough to illuminate the road behind me. Other drivers began flashing their headlights as they passed, probably wondering if I had some kind of equipment malfunction. The colors were cycling faster now, shifting from deep ocean blues to electric greens to violent purples that seemed to pulse in rhythm with something I couldn't identify. By the time I reached Barstow, the light was so bright that I was afraid it might attract attention from the California Highway Patrol. I pulled into a 24-hour truck stop, parking as far from the main building as possible. The whole back end of my trailer was glowing like a neon sign, casting dancing shadows across the asphalt. A few other drivers had started to gather at a safe distance, pointing and whispering among themselves. That's when I heard it for the first time, a sound so low and rhythmic that I felt it more than heard it. It was coming from inside the trailer, a deep thrumming that seemed to resonate through the frame of my truck and up into the cab. The sound matched the pulsing of the lights perfectly, as if whatever was in those 12 crates had synchronized into some kind of collective heartbeat. I tried calling the number my dispatcher had given me, but it went straight to a voicemail that simply said the mailbox was full. The return address on the manifest led to a post office box in Tucson, which wouldn't do me any good until business hours. I was committed to completing the delivery, but I was beginning to understand that this cargo was far from ordinary. The thrumming sound grew stronger as I pulled back onto Interstate 40, heading east through the heart of the desert. The lights had become so bright that they were reflecting off the low clouds above, creating an aurora-like display that followed my truck across the wasteland. Other vehicles were giving me a wide berth now, and I could see people pulled over on the side of the road, filming the spectacle with their phones. Somewhere east of Ludlow, the radio in my cab began picking up interference, a crackling static that seemed to pulse in time with whatever was happening in my trailer. Through the white noise, I could occasionally make out what sounded like voices, speaking in a language I didn't recognize. The words had a fluid, musical quality that was beautiful and deeply unsettling at the same time. As I climbed through the mountains toward Flagstaff, the temperature gauge on my refrigeration unit began fluctuating wildly, despite the fact that the system appeared to be functioning normally. The thrumming sound had become so intense that it was causing my coffee cup to vibrate off the dashboard, and the lights were now bright enough to cast shadows inside my cab. That's when I realized something truly disturbing. The lights weren't just random colors anymore. They were forming patterns, complex geometric designs that would build to brilliant intensity before dissolving and reforming into new configurations. It was as if whatever was in those crates was trying to communicate, sending signals into the desert night that I was completely unequipped to understand. East of Flagstaff, I encountered my first real problem. A highway patrol car had been following me for several miles, obviously curious about the light show I was broadcasting across half of northern Arizona. When the trooper finally pulled me over, I expected the worst. But as he approached my truck, something extraordinary happened. The light suddenly dimmed to almost nothing, and the thrumming sound faded to barely perceptible vibration. The trooper walked around my truck twice, checking my lights and inspector's stickers, then sent me on my way with nothing more than a reminder to keep my running lights clean. It was as if the cargo had somehow sensed the inspection and deliberately concealed itself. The final 100 miles to Tucson passed in an eerie quiet. The lights continued their complex patterns, but at a much lower intensity, and the thrumming sound had settled into a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. I found myself wondering what kind of delivery address would be expecting 12 crates of pulsing, color-shifting unknown materials in the pre-dawn hours of a Wednesday morning. The GPS led me to an industrial district on the outskirts of Tucson, to a facility that looked almost identical to the warehouse in Bakersfield. The same anonymous metal siding, the same minimal lighting, the same unsettling quiet. But this time there was no one waiting to meet me. The weight of nothing. From Marcus, the first time I noticed it, I figured my eyes were playing tricks on me after 18 hours behind the wheel of my Kenworth. You know how it is out here on the long hauls, when the white lines start bleeding together and your mind begins filling in details that aren't really there. But when I walked around my rig during that mandatory rest stop outside Bakersfield, checking the load straps and doing my inspection, I could swear the rear duals weren't quite touching the asphalt. Not by much, mind you, maybe an inch or two, like the whole back end of the trailer was somehow lighter than it should have been. I chalked it up to fatigue and the way the sodium lights were casting shadows across the truck stop parking lot. The amber glow has a way of making everything look wrong, stretched out and distorted like a funhouse mirror. My cargo manifest said I was hauling auto parts from Detroit to Los Angeles. 38,000 pounds of brake rotors and transmission components, well within legal limits. The load should have kept those tires planted firmly on the ground. Should have. But there I was, crouching down and squinting at what looked like a sliver of darkness between the rubber and the road. Sleep came fitfully that night in the sleeper cab. The truck stop hummed with its usual symphony of idling diesels and the distant whoosh of interstate traffic, but something felt off about the way my rig sat. Usually you can feel the weight settling, the slight sway when another truck passes close by, the solid connection between 18 wheels and earth. Instead, there was this strange sensation of disconnection, like being in an elevator that's paused between floors. I told myself it was just the air suspension adjusting, the way these modern trucks level themselves out. But when morning came and I fired up the Caterpillar engine, I could feel it immediately. The truck moved differently, responded to steering inputs with an unsettling lightness that made my stomach tighten with unease. The next several hundred miles passed without incident. The California desert stretched endlessly on both sides of Interstate 40, and the steady drone of the engine began to lull me into the familiar rhythm of long-haul driving. But every time I stopped, whether for fuel or a break or to check the load, there it was again. That impossible gap between tire and pavement, more pronounced now, clearly visible in broad daylight. The trailer tires hovered 3, maybe 4 inches off the ground, defying everything I understood about physics and the weight of the cargo I was carrying. At a Flying J outside Needles, I backed into a parking spot next to another driver, a grizzled veteran named Pete who'd been running these routes longer than I'd been alive. His weathered face creased into a frown when I mentioned what I was seeing, and he walked around my trailer with the slow, deliberate gait of someone who'd inspected thousands of rigs over the decades. When he straightened up from examining the rear axles, his expression had changed. The casual friendliness was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like recognition tinged with worry. He told me about drivers who'd reported similar phenomena over the years, always dismissed by fleet managers and mechanics as optical illusions or equipment malfunctions. But Pete had seen it himself once back in the 80s, hauling a load through Nevada that seemed to get lighter with every mile. He'd watched his trailer tires lift further and further from the road until he was essentially pulling nothing but air behind his cab. The load had been there when he'd picked it up in Reno, properly secured and documented. But somewhere along the way, it had simply ceased to exist in any meaningful sense while still appearing completely normal from the outside. The desert sun was setting as I pulled back onto the interstate, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. But now the approaching darkness felt ominous, and the lightness of my trailer had become so pronounced that crosswinds were pushing me around like an empty box. The cargo straps were still tight, the door still sealed, but something fundamental had changed about what I was hauling. The weight that should have been there had been replaced by something else, something that made the laws of physics bend in ways that sent ice water through my veins. As night fell completely, the sensation of wrongness intensified. My headlights swept across the empty highway ahead, but in the mirrors I began to catch glimpses of something that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. The trailer behind me seemed to shimmer occasionally, like heat mirages rising from summer pavement, and sometimes it appeared to be slightly transparent. Not gone, not invisible, but insubstantial in a way that made my vision blur and my head ache when I tried to focus on it directly. The radio crackled with the usual chatter of drivers reporting their positions and road conditions, but I found myself reluctant to key the microphone. How do you explain to someone that your load is simultaneously there and not there? That you're pulling 38,000 pounds of nothing across the desert, while your trailer floats like a balloon on an invisible string? The very words seemed absurd even in my own mind, yet the evidence was undeniable every time I glanced in the mirrors or felt the unnatural way the truck moved through the night air. Around midnight, as I climbed the grade approaching Barstow, something changed again. The engine RPMs were higher than they should have been for the load I was supposed to be carrying, but instead of the expected resistance, I felt the truck begin to accelerate on its own, not mechanically, as if something was wrong with the throttle or transmission, but as though the trailer behind me had developed its own momentum independent of the tractor unit. The speedometer climbed past 70, past 75, past the governor setting that should have limited my top speed, and still the acceleration continued. I tried downshifting, tried using the engine brake, but the truck responded sluggishly to my inputs. It was as if the connection between cab and trailer had become something other than the mechanical coupling I understood. The kingpin was still locked in place, the electrical connection still functioning to power the trailer lights, but the physical relationship had transformed into something that operated by different rules entirely. Rules that allowed my cargo to exist in a state somewhere between presence and absence, weight and weightlessness. The highway ahead began to curve through rocky outcroppings, and I realized with growing alarm that I was approaching the descent into the San Bernardino Valley much faster than was safe. The floating trailer behind me seemed to be pushing now rather than being pulled, and when I applied the air brakes, the pedal felt mushy and unresponsive. Not empty, as it would if there were a leak in the system, but as though the brakes were trying to stop something that wasn't entirely there to be stopped. The brake lights reflected in my mirrors, casting red glows on pavement that the trailer tires no longer touched. Desperation made me reach for the emergency brake valve, the red knob that would dump all air pressure and bring the rig to a grinding halt, regardless of the consequences to my transmission or the cargo behind me. But as my fingers closed around the plastic handle, I felt the trailer suddenly detach completely from the road, lifting into the darkness like a massive rectangular balloon, filled with automotive parts that had somehow lost their connection to gravity and mass. The kingpin held, the electrical lines remained intact, but I was no longer pulling a trailer in any conventional sense. What followed was a harrowing descent where physics became negotiable and my years of driving experience provided no guidance for the situation I faced. The trailer behind me floated and swayed, sometimes dragging against the road surface and sometimes lifting high enough that I could see stars where the cargo box should have been blocking my view. The weight distribution shifted constantly, making the truck handle like nothing I'd ever experienced. Responsive one moment and completely uncontrollable the next. Somehow, through a combination of luck and desperate maneuvering, I managed to guide the rig into a truck stop at the bottom of the grade. The moment I set the parking brake and shut down the engine, the trailer settled back onto the pavement with a perceptible thud that shook the entire vehicle. The floating sensation vanished instantly, replaced by the familiar solid feel of a properly loaded truck at rest. When I climbed out to inspect the cargo, everything appeared normal. The straps were tight, the doors sealed, the tires now firmly planted on the asphalt as they should have been all along. The delivery in Los Angeles went without incident. The consignee accepted the load, signed the paperwork, and their forklift operators unloaded 38,000 pounds of brake rotors and transmission components exactly as specified on the manifest. Every part accounted for, every box in perfect condition, as if nothing unusual had happened during the journey across the desert. But I knew better now. I understood that sometimes cargo exists in states that can't be measured by conventional scales or understood through normal logistics. I still drive the same routes, still haul similar loads through the same desert highways where the incident occurred, but now I pay closer attention to how my trailer sits when parked, to the way the tires contact the pavement and the subtle sensations that tell. The fire that froze. From Marcus Delacroix, the CB radio had been crackling with warnings all evening about the experimental fuel depot on Highway 49. But I figured it was just another trucker tall tale. The kind that grows longer with each telling over greasy diner coffee. My Peterbilt 379 was running low on diesel, and the gauge needle was kissing empty when I spotted the azure glow cutting through the Montana darkness like a beacon from another world. The sign read Cryotherm Fuel Solutions, premium grade diesel in sleek chrome letters that seemed to shimmer with their own inner light, and below it, in smaller text that made my eyes water to read, Advanced Cooling Technology for Maximum Efficiency. The station materialized from the prairie night like something conjured from a fever dream, all glass and steel angles that reflected the stars in ways that made them look closer than they should have been. Everything about the place hummed with a low-frequency vibration that I could feel in my chest cavity. A thrumming that seemed to sync with my heartbeat until I couldn't tell where the station's pulse ended and mine began. The pumps gleamed like surgical instruments under banks of LED lights that cast no shadows, and the fuel flowing through the transparent hoses moved with an odd, viscous quality that reminded me of liquid mercury. A young attendant emerged from the pristine office, his breath visible in small puffs despite the warm September evening, and his smile was the kind of practiced professional expression that never quite reached the eyes. "Fill her up?" he asked, his voice carrying that same low-frequency hum I'd felt in my ribs. And when I nodded, he began the fueling process with movements that were almost ritualistic in their precision. The diesel that flowed into my tanks was darker than usual, with an oily rainbow sheen that seemed to move independently of the liquid's surface, creating patterns that looked almost like flowing script in a language I didn't recognize. "This is some special fuel," the attendant said, his breath continuing to mist even as beads of sweat formed on his forehead, a contradiction that made me study his face more carefully in the harsh LED glare. Cryotherm's breakthrough technology maintains optimal temperature regulation even under extreme thermal stress. Your engine will run cooler than it ever has before. His pupils were dilated despite the bright lights, and there was something about the way he moved that reminded me of someone walking underwater, every gesture slightly delayed and dreamlike. The receipt he handed me was warm to the touch, almost hot, and the numbers on it seemed to shift and blur when I wasn't looking directly at them, like heat mirages on summer asphalt. As I climbed back into my cab, I noticed ice crystals forming on the exterior of my fuel lines, delicate fractals that grew and spread even as the engine's heat should have melted them instantly. The Caterpillar engine turned over with a sound I'd never heard before, a purring rumble that seemed to contain harmonics and overtones that resonated in my bones. Miles rolled by under my wheels as the highway stretched through the endless Montana darkness, and gradually I became aware that something fundamental had changed in the relationship between my truck and the road. The engine temperature gauge, which had always run hot on long hauls, now hovered in the blue zone, so far below normal operating temperature that by all rights the engine should have seized up entirely. Yet the Peterbilt ran smoother than silk, each cylinder firing with mechanical perfection that felt almost supernatural in its precision. The first sign of real trouble came when I tried to light a cigarette at a rest stop outside Billings. The flame from my lighter, when it touched the small droplet of spilled fuel on my fingers, didn't burn the liquid away as it should have. Instead, the diesel seemed to extinguish the flame while simultaneously becoming solid, forming a crystalline coating over my skin that radiated cold so intense it burned. I scraped the substance off with a fingernail, watching it sublime directly from solid to vapor, skipping the liquid phase entirely like dry ice. Back on the road, the temperature anomalies began to manifest in ways that defied every law of thermodynamics I thought I understood. Steam was rising from my exhaust pipes, but when I stopped to investigate, the vapor felt cold against my skin, and where it touched the metal of my tools, frost patterns bloomed like living things. The fuel gauge, which should have been dropping steadily after 4 hours of highway driving, had barely moved, as if the cryotherm diesel was somehow regenerating itself or burning with impossible efficiency. It was past midnight when I noticed the other trucks. They appeared in my mirrors first, distant headlights that seemed to maintain exactly the same speed and following distance no matter how I adjusted my own velocity. When they pulled alongside me on the empty interstate, I could see that they were all different makes and models, but they all had the same telltale frost patterns spreading across their fuel lines, and the same impossible steam rising from exhaust stacks that should have been burning hot. The drivers looked straight ahead with expressions of dreamy concentration, their cab windows fogged with condensation that formed geometric patterns too regular to be natural. My CB radio crackled to life with voices that sounded like they were calling from the bottom of a frozen lake, distorted and echoing with that same low-frequency hum I'd felt at the fuel station. "Brother, you feeling that cold fire burning in your engine?" one voice asked. And another responded, "Cold fire, yes. Cold fire that never consumes, never ends, just keeps feeding itself." I reached for the handset to respond, but my fingers were stiff with cold despite the warm cab temperature, and when I exhaled, my breath came out in visible puffs just like the attendants had. The convoy of affected trucks grew larger as the night progressed, vehicles emerging from on-ramps and side roads like moths drawn to some invisible flame, all of us moving in perfect synchronized formation at exactly 63 miles per hour. Every attempt to change speed or direction felt like swimming against a powerful current, and I realized with growing horror that my truck was no longer entirely under my conscious control. The steering wheel moved in my hands with subtle corrections that I wasn't making, keeping me in perfect alignment with the other vehicles. Dawn was breaking over the Wyoming border when I saw our destination rising from the plains ahead like a massive geometric crystal, a structure that seemed to be built from the same materials as the fuel station, but on a scale that dwarfed anything human architecture should attempt. The building's surfaces reflected the morning sun in ways that hurt to look at directly, and the air around it shimmered with heat distortion, despite the ice that covered every surface for miles in all directions. Dozens of trucks were already parked in perfect rows in the facility's lot, their drivers standing motionless beside their vehicles with expressions of serene emptiness. As my truck rolled to a stop in the predetermined position, I felt the cryotherm fuel in my tank's pulse with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat, and I understood with awful clarity that the diesel hadn't just been feeding my engine. It had been feeding on my engine's heat, on my truck's mechanical energy, on something more fundamental that I didn't want to name. The cold fire that burned without consuming was preparing to consume something else entirely, something that made the metal and fuel seem trivial by comparison. I managed to throw the truck into reverse and floor the accelerator, just as the other drivers began to turn toward me with movements that were no longer entirely human. The Peterbilt's engine screamed in protest, fighting against whatever force was trying to hold it in place, and for one terrible moment I thought the transmission would tear itself apart. Then something gave way with an almost audible snap, and I was racing back toward the highway with frost patterns spreading across my windshield from the inside. The truck stop where I'm writing this is 200 miles from that place, and I've been here for 3 days trying to get the cryotherm fuel out of my system. Every mechanic I've talked to just looks at the crystalline residue in my tanks and shakes their head, saying they've never seen anything like it. The temperature gauge still reads cold, so cold that ice forms on the glass, and sometimes late at night I can hear that low-frequency humming coming from somewhere deep in the engine compartment. But the worst part is the dreams. Dreams of driving through endless frozen landscapes where the fuel never runs out and the engine never stops, where the cold fire burns forever without consuming anything except the part of you that remembers what warmth felt like. And when I wake up, my breath is always visible in the air above my bunk, even on the hottest summer nights.